Welcome everybody who is here in the audience, and also welcome to everybody who's joining us online on YouTube. Today we celebrate 5 years of Striatech, and we are very happy that all of you are here to join us today. For a little startup company, it cannot be taken for granted that one makes it, right? So our products have been received well, and with this symposium, we like to give back to the science community with nice and interesting and exciting scientific presentations. We will have 3 speakers today who will share their work and their experiences and their thoughts on our topic, opportunities, hopes, and challenges in translating visual restoration from mouse to human. A word about our agenda. We will hear presentations of Professor Eberhart Zrenner from Tübingen, from Miikka Terho from Finland, and Professor Constance Cepko from Harvard, who will join us online via a Zoom meeting later on. These 3 presentations will be before the lunch break, and after the 1-hour lunch break, we will have a moderated panel discussion with the 3 speakers who will be moderated by Ulrike Till, who is a science journalist who is local here in Tübingen. After each of the 3 presentations in the morning, you will have time for questions, both here from the audience as well for the online audience. You can enter your questions in the chat and in the YouTube chat, and we will bring them up here. With no further ado, I wish to welcome our first speaker, Professor Eberhart Zrenner, Senior Professor at the University of Tübingen. Professor Zrenner had a long and illustrious career and has received many awards. I have known him personally for about 15 years. So I want to point out just one thing that I have always found fascinating about him, of the many things. And that is, throughout his career, he has shown a dedication to basic science and basic research. And I found that this is not very common in medical doctors. This dedication to basic research is reflected by his own education. He has worked at the Max Planck Institute as a postdoctoral fellow, and also by his work here in Tübingen, where he attached a research institute to the University Eye Clinic. Professor Zrenner also has a connection to our company, Striatech. During the founding phase, about 5 years ago, he graciously agreed to be our mentor. Thank you very much for that, Professor Zrenner. Today he will talk about the Retina Implant chip as a way to restore vision in blind patients and the challenges that arise from this. So Professor Zrenner, I'm very happy that you agreed to talk here today, and I'm looking forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for the kind invitation and especially for your introduction right now. And I want to congratulate you for a 5-year anniversary, because we need people like you who are scientists, who understand our needs, who have the inventive power to solve the problems we have in the lab and to improve thereby our research. Thank you so much, and I hope that you and your team, it's of course always a team, are very successful in the future and may, multiply your activities. So all the best to you. I think we should congratulate all. Now, I will speak today about how to get images into the brain of blind people with electronic implants. It will be a story of sophisticated devices which really first time in the history of mankind, that sounds very dramatic, were put into an eye, but that's the truth. And it will also be a quick walk through a 25 years endeavor full of dreams, full of frustrations, but also very unexpected highlights. And I'm very happy that Miikka Terho, really a key who gave us the first clear impression that it will work many years ago, actually, and to tell about his travel, so to say, through the landscape of implants. And it will be about competition of several participants in this endeavor. Which of the approaches is the optimal one? And finally, I will tell you about the reason why none of these approaches presently has survived. And there is nothing on the market for our patients like now, but we have learned a lot. And I will tell you about getting up, put your act together, stand up, and go on. So I think that fits the topic of today's opportunities, hopes, and challenges, and hopes again, and challenges again, of the Striatech Symposium. So it's really great to be here, and thank you for coming and joining. Okay, the target disease of most of those implants is retinitis pigmentosa since many years, but very recently also age-related macular dystrophy came into the research area in Paris and Philadelphia, Pittsburgh. And that's, of course, a new field which opens right now, but is not open yet to patients on the market. Now, what is retinitis pigmentosa? It's a disease, inherited disease, where slowly the peripheral retina usually starts to degenerate, and you see the pigments here, and only a central island remains here. So the patient in the beginning has a loss of night vision because of the loss of rods, a loss of visual field, a loss of visual acuity at the end, and because the photoreceptors are lost, blindness arrives, at least legal blindness arrives later in life in most cases. But the good thing is that in this disease, that's why it's a target, the optic nerve, although it is a little bit pale, still has enough fibers to bring the information from the retina to the brain. So implants would work with trauma or stroke or something like that if the central apparatus is not working anymore. And that's why this disease is selected, I think, because it's only, so to say, the rods, 120 million rods that are affected, and the 6.5 million cones in the retina that are affected. And you can see, because of the reduced number of axons, only 1.2 million, that a lot of pre-processing of vision information is happening in the retina. And of course, there are many neurons who analyze the image back here. So we would like, that was our approach in Tübingen, to use this still remaining natural processing power of the retina. Others don't, and I will explain that in a moment. So the general aim is restore some useful vision in completely blind patients. Some useful vision, because it's very clear that we never will reach the density of the cones in the fovea by electrical means. There must be other methods, but there are no other at the moment. So implants are still a way to help those who have no cells to treat by biological measures anymore. Okay, what are the principal approaches? Those who are not so deeply in the retina, on the right, you see here the light is coming in, falling through the transparent retina onto the, so to say, image screen, which is a retinal pigment epithelium. In the pigment epithelium, the light-sensitive parts of the photoreceptors are positioned. This is the yellow part here. Then the next neuron comes the bipolar cells, and then the ganglion cells with their axon who who bring the information to the brain. And what's not in here are all the many very important laterally connected neurons who do the processing. You'll see that a little bit in that picture here, where you have the rods and the cones and all the neurons in the inner retina here who do this natural computing, so to say. So, of course, at the end, the visual cortex, he can learn a lot also to so to say, make out something from distorted pictures is very essential and has to be intact. But this apparatus of the retina is so great that we would like to use it, as I said. But there are three approaches. There is the epiretinal approach, for instance, by second sight Argus 2 device and others, for instance, Nanoretina in Israel. So they already link their electrodes to the fibers to activate the brain. They do not use the rest of the retina. That means they have to pre-process technically outside in a goggle and in electronics. Our Tübingen approach is different. We put the implant under the retina. That's why it's called subretinal sensor system. So this is light sensitive, plus amplifiers, plus electrodes. I will explain that later. So light is coming in, it's processed right in the eye. We do not have a camera, we do not have any external processing units except the power. Of course, we need to put power into the system for the amplification and so on. And there are the electrodes who stimulate the neurons of the retina, so to say, from their origin, where they are connected to the natural photoreceptors. That's a place where they are connected to the natural photoreceptors patients have lost. And there is another approach, the suprachoroidal approach, because you can imagine this is pretty difficult surgery. Some people, especially in Japan, thought, okay, let's be careful. We go from behind of the eye, or almost from behind of the eye. Yes, we have the pigment epithelium, we have the choroid here, that's why it's called suprachoroidal, that is a blood supply, but it's more safe. So, who will, in some years, win the race? We don't know. But before anything can be applied to patients, we have to do preclinical work from mouse to the man. So what we do and did for years was to put little pieces of retina onto a microelectrode array. That's here, this microelectrode array with 60 electrodes. We take degenerated retina. There are no photoreceptors. Right away there are the bipolar cells, probably some inner segments of the photoreceptors, where we can stimulate with these black things. These are the electrodes, and record from ganglion cells. And look what happens. So we see spikes. Each dot is a spike. So with 0.6 volt, just a few spikes are seen. With 1.2 volt, you see already at each stimulation with a short pulse, you see a response here, summarized in the post-stimulus spike histogram. So a little response is here, and 1.8 volt, there is a clear response at every single stimulus. So what we can say then is, from the knowledge we had about the resistance in the retina and the charge per electrode, which we could measure because of impedance we had measured, we knew that we need at least 0.4 nanocoulomb, it's pretty small, up to 8 to 10 nanocoulomb where it saturates. That means we have a little more than 1 log unit dynamic range. And that means that the current is 0.4 or so microampere at 2 volt. So we have to think about water electrolysis and a number of things to find our way through this jungle of difficulties which biology is doing with us. It's not like going to the moon where you say that's a rocket, that's a weight, that's a distance, you need that is the weight of the fuel, and then go on. It's not that easy, I know, but just to compare with biology, where you go to a jungle and you may end up suddenly in front of a huge mountain or a large sea where you have to go around. So because this may be an audience of engineers and biologists that try to make them understand each other, the difficulties. So here is something else. What is the spatial resolution? So what we do, pretty much the same thing like before, but we have a tsunami going from distant, so to say, slowly towards our recording electrodes. There's nothing yet all the time, but as we come closer, we have a little inhibition, and very close to it, suddenly we have a nice signal at a distance roughly of 100 micrometer. So it's a pretty nice resolution in this experiment. And if we do, so to say, edge distance tuning curve, and we simply take the number of spikes in the distance from the recording electrode, we see that, let's say, 50% is around 100 micrometer distance from the electrode. So that's why we say, okay, we need a roughly 100 micrometer sized electrode. We need at least 1 to 10 nanocoulomb, whatever we do with voltage and current. We have a dynamic range of 1.2 and a temporal resolution with flicker and double flashes that is up to 30 Hertz. So that's all you know. Now you have to make a device who has such characteristics. So we had a dream at that time. That is a dream, not a lady with a special resolution. So we have said, okay, with 1600 pixels we can do a lot. That's what you see here. We just have done 1600 pixels at 8 different levels of grayness. That means the dynamic range. We have 1 log unit. And we can see that it's a female, that she's laughing, that she's squinting a little bit probably. She has no goggles. But there were 3 or so patients among the 65 which got this implant who had seen. I have a special patient in my mind now. He told me spontaneously, oh, I have seen this morning my wife that she was smiling at me, because there's a contrast between the teeth and the rest of the environment. And the same patient said, yes, I have seen a friend who didn't know he has goggles, and I found my telephone on my table. So such things happen, but not in all patients, because the degeneration of the retinitis pigmentosa has more than 300 genes involved. So many different causes, and you cannot expect that all the degeneration process runs, so to say, according to a law as plastic age. It's really very different in each of our patients. So still now there are many groups, 30 or so, working on visual prosthesis and trying to solve the final, find the final solution, so to say, for a prosthesis which is very useful in daily living. Now, by February 2019, there were still 3 implants on the market, or at least in Paris, available to patients. That is our Retina Implant Alpha, which we got the CE mark from the regulatory authority in 2016. It's subretinal. We did all together at the end 72 patients. I told you about the pixel size, and it's natural image projection. There's nothing outside. Patient looks simply where he wants to look, and nobody really knows except that little piece here where the power is put onto our implant. The other approach was Argus 2. He had very many patients in US. We were just in Europe. It's an external camera, 60 electrodes, and it needs some head movement because of the goggles, to localize something. Our patients could move their eyes, and also that the refreshing of images needed a little head shake. It's all not big problems, but it's just very different use as a consequence of the epiretinal position. And the prima vision is in age-related macular degeneration. It's a purely photovoltaic array. It's like what you have in solar cells in the retina. So what they have to do, they have to have a light amplification in front of the eye, because normal light is not enough to generate enough current to stimulate the retina. You see the visual acuity, which can be reached, is around what the layman says 3 to 4% in the best case, or 1% at Argus 2 reported. And that means 20/546. A patient who has that, so to say, by another disease, he would be able to read in a 1 meter distance letters of a size of my hand, roughly, or between my thumb and my index finger. Okay, just to give you a feeling about. So now let's look at the principle of our subretinal implant. Here you have a more elaborated scheme of the retina. Light is going through the transparent retina. There are photodiodes who pick up the light. There are amplifiers behind, 1,600 amplifiers in a 100 micrometer thick and 4 millimeter sized squared implant here. And electrodes, of course, these little black dots here, who transform what the natural photoreceptors are doing, light into an electrical pulse, and is stimulating bipolar and horizontal cells, if left, and then the retina uses that to process and send it through the fibers to the brain. But we need, you see that here a little bit in more detail, how that is working. We need a power supply line. So there is a very thin foil with golden wire, so to say, that leave the eye at the periphery, are a loop in the orbit, and then they go along under the skin, along the orbital rim here, back to behind the ear. And there is, like in the auditory system, they use the very same principle. They have a coil which receives, like a transformer, by another coil outside of the skin. I will show that in a moment. The necessary energy. In our case, we also have additional lines where we control gain and sensitivity of the amplifiers, because you need to adapt to the 10 logarithmic units of light strength we have between tonight going to the Neckarmüller in the dim light, and then if you go out at lunch to looking at a white wall. We need a large range, and so the patient can adjust. We had an automatic adjustment, but the patient liked to do it themselves manually, mostly in most cases. So now, why do we do the subretinal? This is just a summary of the device, so to say. So photodiodes and electrodes correspond to the right location where the brain has learned here is a spot, then it sees the spot in the visual field right at the place where the natural photoreceptor had seen it previously. If you put an electrode epiretinally, you probably stimulate fibers. That's known, it's not probably. You stimulate in some electrode fibers, but the fibers come from a place where the brain has learned it's up there. So the corresponding between the outer world geometrically and the inner world, which sees these geometries of the electrodes, is different. We can utilize the remaining networks. The fixation is easier. We need no tack. Argus 2 had a tack through, a real tack through, which was anchored in the sclera. It's not a big problem, but it's an extra problem to remove it a bit. It's a bit of a problem. Fixation of the chip is easier. It's like in the vacuum package of the peanuts, because there's a little vacuum between retinal pigment epithelium and the neuroretina. There are no visible parts outside except under the hair behind the ear. And also the natural microsaccades refresh the image. You know, a frog doesn't see anything. He sees only if something is moving because he cannot move his eyes. And if we stabilize your eye by tricks, then you will lose the image in a few seconds. So we need these microsaccades, and so our chip really scans like the natural eye permanently the scene, tells of course the brain all the time where it looks at, so it can be a stable picture which doesn't disappear. We still have problems with the refreshing, but that probably later. And that's what the patient is doing. Transmitter antenna, I tell it a little bit later. That was the first power box at that time to control brightness and contrast, actually. So we did a lot of studies, a pilot study with 11 patients, and Miikka Terho, who will speak to you in a moment, got one of those. Here he is. I hope the movie works, which we will show. We did later on a multi-center study with 29 patients with a wireless power and signal transmission. And then we did a second generation retina implant because of survival time of the implants of the first generation was limited. And Miikka again joined this study. Finally, when we were on the market, we did a surveillance study, which could be completed only in 5 patients of the 14 I think we had implanted. So let's look how to get that. That's a novelty too in ophthalmology, how to get that implant into the subretinal space. So the first is to make a little window in the sclera. That's the right part. There's no neurons we need in there. Then I make a cut. You see the black retinal pigment epithelium down there. And then you take a flexible plastic thing, a guiding foil, and slowly advance it between the retinal pigment epithelium and the fovea until the tip reaches the center of the retina, go a little bit beyond. So that's usually marked. And then the neuroretina is protected by this foil, and so behind the neuroretina, the surgeon advances the implant. So you see below this blue foil now the implant slowly coming, advancing to the right place with the chip in place. So our aim is always to put it to the fovea because that's where the brain has the most analyzing neurons being addressed then. I should say, we never, yes, we had to replace one. We had bleeding in one case, but we never had to, let's say, break off the surgery and saying, no, now everything is gone or so, whatever you could imagine what could happen. But it needs really trained surgeons. That's how it looks like then. A few days after. So you even can, if you look to the eye, into the pupil, into the eye, you can read which implant it is. You see the vessels because the transparent retina and the optic nerve is here. So, and these are these cables which are then controlling gain sensitivity and providing the broader ones the power to the amplifiers. Okay, then 3 weeks later, functional tests. We start with screen, where light detection, simply light, yes, no. Then also two flashes for temporary resolution. Then also grids with different spatial frequency. Then localization is the flashlight looking left, right, or so. And then Landolt rings for defining the spatial resolution. So that worked pretty well. And here is an example with Miikka. So you see, you don't really, at that time this was a wire-bound one, so you see a wire coming out behind the ear. But there's nothing in front of the eye. And he tells us where the gap is.
This one opens to the left. One glance. This opens to the top.
Right. And then another one.
Just one direction. Opens to the right.
And so on, and they were all correct. That was wonderful. And then we had a special event. We said, okay, we have to look about reading. It wouldn't be possible. So somebody put a black piece of paper and put his name on there, M-I-K-A. He looked a little bit and then he said, well, here, do you think I am... because I...
One eye missing and the second eye and second K. Oh! His name is...
So he is not Miikka Hakkonen, the famous racing specialist, Formula One driver at that time. And we were very surprised and saying that a patient tells us, you have made a spelling error in my name. So that was, of course, one of the great moments, my best spelling errors I ever had. Okay, and we had, of course, as I showed you, various cooperation partners worldwide, and why don't I see? I can start. Oh, here. And this lady is in Oxford, makes her first outdoor visit.
There's the bridge going across there. It's all light up there, and it's lighter there. You've got the bridge going across.
And so on. She described it very nicely. Or here in Tübingen, you can go to the Stiftskirche, into that particular coffee, as a kind of probably 12-year anniversary of that movie. And a patient who went and
So, jetzt habe ich hier. Hier.
Ja,
Und ist das jetzt mein Glas, oder?
wahrscheinlich. Warum? Was tut's
Weil
da?
es jetzt hier dunkler wird.
Ach, der wird dunkler. Ah, guck. Ja.
Und am Rand ist hell, dann wird es dunkler und dann wird es wieder heller. Ja, das ist mein Glas.
Ja. Passen Sie mal hin, da wo Sie sehen. Ah ja, alles klar. Jetzt ist die Frage, wo ist das Besteck?
Da.
Ja, als eins, ja. Und wenn Sie weitergehen, gibt es noch ein zweites.
Hier.
Hier.
So that was, of course, great. You have seen she didn't take it like at the present Oktoberfest from the side, because she has only one eye operated, but she went at the glass from the front because of the missing depth perception. But you see, in some patients it's pretty useful, but another lady said, no, in the coffee I switch it off because I want to speak with my colleagues and not play around with the implant. So these are the different people. And in summary, this part, there were 29 patients, 6 were very good, 7 had useful visual experience, 8 localized at least, so that was the endpoint. Reached the endpoint. In 8 it didn't work, 4 of them because of technical problems and 4 of them because I just felt it's too complicated to run, so I didn't use it. So we had a problem. The implant in the eye was not surviving more than a year or so because the body nicely tolerates the implant, but the implant didn't tolerate the body fluids. So we had to work hard a few years, and then we got up to a lifetime of 4.7 years in artificial accepted measures. And then in 2006 we became commercial. And the healthcare system told us, yes, you can do 6 surgeries per year. And it was produced by our Retina Implant company nearby, the next village, founded in 2003. And you see, you know already, It's very similar to the first generation. There is this subdermal power supply, just to show to you one time. This is a little chip here. Now the patient had a better box here where he could not only switch on and off, but also address gain and so to say, to control brightness and contrast. Okay, patient had a number of experience, but it was only 1/3 of the patients, and that's always difficult in medicine. It started always in medicine like that. The hip replacement, the cardiac maker, that they failed after a while, and not every patient could be helped. But these are the best examples, so to say, the shape of another's head, glasses, and so on. I don't read it all. You may just quickly scan that. It was a lot of narrative from patients, street lamps at nights, landmarks, dog moving, black and white dog, sunflowers, the moon suddenly, all surprising. I didn't expect sitting in the garden, oh, here is the moon, something like that. So they had very many good examples that it can work. Doesn't mean it does work in every patient. So what we then did, we tried these narratives to statistically approach. You know how difficult it is. Everybody says something different, has different perceptions. So we simply said on a table, how many objects are there? And we always switch the implant on, the power on, and then the power off. So with power off, there are, of course, false positives, the red ones. And with power on, you have statistically improved question of the number of patients, or number of items on the table. But what it is more difficult. This is the last little movie. It was very early after surgery. Patient is still pretty excited, seeing cup and...
Yeah, I could see. Yeah.
Okay, so you see it is working, but not the way it is. So finally, we have learned, okay, this is a textbook to start a startup till the user, but that's not the real way it works. Why were only 14 users receiving an implant? And that was a part of it, the reimbursement in the healthcare system. Reimbursement healthcare system all over the world is extremely difficult. In every little county and country you have different rules, and if you are not a large company, you just cannot do that. That's a real challenge of surviving this phase. And there are new players, the customers, the physician, the health insurance system, and I quickly go through that. Travel from 1995 to 2016, there is no direct path from a registered medical device to a patient with extremely tedious procedures. And the expectation of the patients, they want to see faces, they want to be mobile, to go to the provinzialische Markt and so on by themselves. The comments were, say, I have no guarantee the chip will work. That was not the case in the initial participants, because they like to participate. But now if the health insurance has to pay 90,000 euro, I want to see the football match on the TV, and I cannot have all this time for training, and I will not lose my compensation for blindness, no danger, but my doctor recommends I wait for better alternatives. And the physician says, oh, they are not good enough, I won't recommend the surgery, that is really a new surgery, very difficult. I have not seen patients, you did it in my office really. I have no candidates for implant. And the hospital budget says, oh, every implantation takes so many hours. It's really a financial loss of our hospital. We can do 6 cataract surgeries in that time. And the insurance said, where is the study of cost-benefit? There are many other good things nowadays, and we will fight against covering these costs. Also, it is legally accepted, and they have to pay, but we first fight with all legal instruments through all instances until we give you any euro. So, and you know, the desires of the patients, it should be discreet. It should be a wireless charging. It should be programming through my mobile and easy, like the cochlear implant, something like that. And retina implant and second sight couldn't fulfill such desires and couldn't get the necessary funds by the healthcare system. So we both stopped the distribution, but there was no bankruptcy. Patients were still cared for many years, those who had implant. But we said, get up, get your act together, go back to mice, that's then so to say the way back, do a better implant, and now we do the retina sensor now, ultra-sensitive, high-sensitive microsensors with novel stimulation. We just had published last year on nature-inspired saccadic-like stimulation with a group of my colleague Hack in the institute here, and together with people in Zurich. I don't go much deeper. You can imagine what has to be done to achieve that. And just to translate to the next speaker, after the next speaker, patient said, yeah, there is gene replacement, there is trophic factors. No, this is not for the blind. If there are no cells, you cannot treat. Optogenetics may do the job. There's one patient so far treated, and not better than an implant either. And there may be cell therapies. I say, okay, but there is no cell therapy yet either. So enormous progress has been made. Many patients have benefited, but we cannot predict what and who, to which extent somebody will benefit. So the expectations are high, regulatory processes are too long, and even small modifications require years until they are on the market. And there are alternative solutions still. We know what to do. Higher spatial resolution, larger visual field, improved contrast, probably color, difficult, shorter surgical procedures, effortless to use, integration of apps, and although no longer available for implantation in men, there is not any implant right now on the market. We learned a lot, and we know what to do to make a better job. And finally, I would like to thank all the teams. I just can do that short, and the men. And there have been many visions around, you know, but the reality is still different. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Zrenner. We have time for 2, maybe 3 questions. So just raise your hand. We have people in the audience walking around with microphones.
We also have a roundtable discussion where some...
If you bring the microphone there. Somebody coming, yes. Thank you.
So, do you have? Are you able to preserve the function of the pigmental retinal epithelium, the blood retinal permeability function?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's of course a very important question, because you have seen with our implant we cover the retina from the choroid, which is very important to support the function and survival of photoreceptors. But the retina has 2 circuits, the choroid and the retinal circuit. And the retinal circuit with all the capillaries goes up to the horizontal cells. So we don't need really, for maintaining retina, the choroidal circuit. We did a few holes also, but it wasn't really necessary. So we learned that in the animal experiments. But very good question.
Are there more questions at the moment? Because if not, we have a chance to catch up a bit in time. Yeah. Thank you so much for being here, Professor Zrenner, and for this insightful talk.
Okay, shall I leave that here?
Maybe you can just cut it close.
Okay.
All right, so let me invite the next speaker. This is Miikka Terho from Finland. He was already introduced by Professor Zrenner. He was one of the first implant patients. And so this is what we will talk about today. So in his real life, Miikka studied finance, and he was also a university teacher for finance, economics, and marketing. He also had his own company in sports management, and with his company, he helped young athletes to gain sports scholarships at American colleges. And one of those young people was Daniel Jansson, who is now head coach of the Tübingen Tigers, the professional basketball team here in Tübingen, who plays in the first on top German league. But today he will not talk about finance. He will talk about his experience as a patient, participating in these studies, also about his experience, how it felt to become blind in the first place. And we are very grateful that he made the trip to Finland for the symposium. And I invite him to join us here on the stage. One corner more. That's right. Okay. There we go. Yes, the microphone is in front of you. Ready? You're ready.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Thomas, and for the company to invite me here. So my name is Miikka Terho, and I'm gonna shortly talk about a little bit about the history of my visual deterioration, and then I will talk about my experiences with the first chip in 2008, and then I got the second one in 2017. And then I will shortly compare my experiences between the first and the second one, and especially the way I saw things. And the second chip, the one that I got in 2017, it was explanted just two and a half months ago this summer. So at the end of June. So I had the second chip for a little over 6 years. But now I decided to take it out because the project doesn't give a good support anymore. So it was not good enough benefits, but okay, I'll come back to that a little bit later. So my RP case was quite usual, but then also very unusual because, as Professor Zrenner just shortly said, in most cases the RP starts first on the peripheral areas. So people start losing the peripheries, but the central area stays open. My case is, I think it's even officially called inverse RP. About 10% about the RP cases are like that, even less. So I started first losing the central area, and the peripheral areas stayed much, much better for a lot longer. So that made it a little different case. So I never had a tunnel vision like most people. So I noticed the first symptoms as like a young teenager, 16, 17, just like pretty poor night vision, but that was pretty much all. Practically, I had a normal eyesight. And then what I started learning about the deterioration process, I have not been diagnosed at the age of 20 yet, or early 25s. But then I noticed things when I like to play sports, and a good example would be just the ball sports. Like, for example, playing the game of squash. Small ball, very quick one. So then I started noticing at the age of like 20, 21, around that age, that I started mishitting the ball quite often. Hand-eye coordination did not work anymore. The ball was too small, too quick. So something was missing on my visual fields. And then, but at those moments, those weeks and months, I was still able to play tennis. Bigger ball, slower ball. And then about a year later or something, then I started mishitting the tennis ball more often and often. But then I was still able to play football. Again, bigger ball, slower ball. But then eventually that also became pretty impossible. So this was kind of like a very, very slow progression in my case. First symptoms before I was 20 years old until I became officially blind at the age of around 40. So it was like about 20, 25 years. Very slow. And especially this slow progression made it easier for me. I was able to do all my university years with normal eyesight. I even drove a car until I was 27 years old. I was not able to play football anymore, but I was able to drive a car. So the biggest problem was with contrast. Bright daylight. Like, for example, I decided to stop driving a car because I was feeling so uncomfortable driving just on a regular daylight, then entering a tunnel or the parking hall. Of course, they had lights on the tunnel and the parking hall, but the contrast difference was so, I always needed like 3-4 seconds to get my eyes adapted to the contrast difference of lighting. So by driving a car, it was impossible. And that was pretty much the slow progression throughout the 1990s. A little by little, the reading ability became worse and worse. But still, at the end of like 1990s, I was not able to recognize faces anymore, not able to read properly, other than with good contrast on the computers. But I was still able to walk around on the streets without any problems because my peripheral areas were open. Only the face recognition, the central area, was gone, pretty much. But then walking around, I did not recognize people who came towards me on the street, but I saw the shapes because of the peripheral. So that was until around millennium, when I was like 30, 35. And then I pretty much became officially blind, just before I was 40 years old. And then at that time in 2004-05, I started getting interested in the scientific research around the world. And then I found out about the project here in Tübingen. And I was accepted to be a part of the pilot study in 2007, 2008. So I came first time to Tübingen in 2008 to get my first pilot study retinal chip. And that was interesting. I mean, I had not been able to read anything for about 6, 7, 8 years. Had been completely blind for like 4 or 5 years. So it was quite new to me. I mean, I had still very good visual memories of everything. And then with our 2008 study, then the results were extremely good. As you saw a couple of those videos, we were able to get the breakthrough results scientifically. I was able to read the letters on a table, also to do the Landel-C testing, see very many different things on the computer screen, like different shapes of geometrical objects. I was able to recognize them. Also on the table in front of me to see the plates and forks and knives and spoons and mugs. I was able to separate them. But still, it was not normal seeing. It was I needed a high contrast difference. For example, dark color or black table clothing, and then some like white or shiny objects on the top of it. If it was only a white table clothing and then white plates or light color objects on the top of it, I was not able to see them because there was not enough contrast. And that was also the same thing with all my seeing with the first chip. The most interestingly about seeing how I saw the shapes of people with the first chip. So we once did a good interesting testing, it was just like a room, pretty much like this, large auditorium, a large classroom. And I had like 3 persons standing like 10 meters away from me. And I was asked if it was a dark room and it was a dark wall. And people had very light color clothing on top of it. Again, high contrast, which was necessary in my case. But I was able to recognize all those shapes of those people and even walk to them. And quite interestingly, I never saw colors. It was just like watching a black and white TV. But still I saw the different shades of gray. And for example, in the person case, one person had a white doctor's coat on her. One person had a yellow shirt. And then the third one had a blue or something like light blue jacket or pullover. And I was able to see they were standing a few meters away from each other, 10 meters away from me, and I was able to recognize all of them, the shapes of people. And how they looked in my eye was, okay, the white one, I always say she looked like the brightest. And then the yellow shirt was like, a little grayer, not as clear as white. And then, of course, the blue jacket one was dimmer. But still, that's how I saw the colors. Pretty much like a black and white TV times. Of those of you who remember watching black and white TV, I do. I was born in the 60s. And now the most interesting is the way you probably want to know how I saw those things, because like I said, it was far away from normal seeing. For example, the objects on the table, like plates and forks and knives, I didn't get the full shape of them, but I was able to localize and recognize. And then when I needed a little scanning, the open area was quite small in my eye, so I needed to learn how to scan. For example, one plate was too large for my chip area. I needed to scan a little bit, so I noticed the round shape of a plate. The forks and knives, first they looked like straight lines in my eye, but when I started focusing more of them, I was able to see the pikes of a fork. And then, of course, I knew the next one must be a knife because there were no. And the spoon has some like a round top of it. And everything was kind of shivery in my eye. It was not steady. So it was kind of pulsing. I think I used 6 hertz frequency on a chip at the moment. It was testing wise, it was the maximum. So it was not the steady picture. 6 hertz is kind of like a pulsing all the time. But that was not a big problem because I learned quite quickly to avoid it. And still I was able to recognize the things. And but everything looked a little shivery. They were not steady. And it was like, the lines on the screen, on the computer screen, they were like going from left to right. And sometimes even breaking in the middle, and in a split second it was connected again, even though of course the line on the computer screen was connected all the time. But on my eye, it was just like a broken, just like a radio channel being not on the right position. So then you understand what comes on the radio, but it's like keeps cracking a little bit. And also when I looked at those persons in a room that I just told you, they were not steady shapes on my visual field. They were also pulsing, like flicking in my eye. And kind of like a shivering kind of an image is pretty much like, I would say like, think about ghosts coming through the wall in a movie or something like, shivery kind of like a whitish kind of figures. So that's the way I saw things. It was far away from normal seeing. But it was very interesting project, and especially to have this pretty good resolution, to be able to recognize items after many, many years, and to get this breakthrough scientific proof that it's possible to restore some type of a vision. So that was pretty much everything that I kind of like want to remember to tell about those kind of things. We can talk about this a little later if you have questions. But then we went to the next one. So that was like 2008, 2009 when I had the first chip, only for about 6-8 weeks, because that was a pilot study, strictly regulated. And then I waited for about 7-8 more years. The development of the chip and the technologies of wires and connections continued, and I was just I was aware of all the developments. I was in close contact with Tübingen all the time throughout those years. So, and then in 2017 became a time when CE company had received the CE mark for the chip, and then I got my second one, which was supposed to be so-called permanent one. No one knew how long it's gonna be viable and efficient, but everybody thought that, it's definitely more than months. It should be few years. Okay, in spring 17, I got the second chip. Of course, I had no high expectations. I was realistic that, my retinal condition has continued degeneration over the last 7-8 years. So I had no high expectations. I really wanted to be not a pessimist, but just a realist. Let's see how the next chip works, if I can get the similar results or even close to something similar. But then when we started testing it and using the second chip, it was quite different. I didn't get this good resolution anymore. I was able to locate things on the table even easier than with the first one, but I didn't get the shapes anymore. Even if I looked at the similar kind of like a table setting with forks and knives and spoons, I was able to know, okay, there must be, I knew the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different objects on the table, and I was able to point at them, but I didn't get the shapes. I didn't even get the simple lines or round ones that easily. But everything looked much, much steadier in my eye. The first one we used 6 hertzes. Now we used between 10 and 20. I like that more, because when I looked at, for example, lights, like street lights outside, when it was dark in the evenings, again, high contrast, always better with me. Then looking at the street lights with 20 hertz frequency, the lights looked steady. They were not like, flickering, pulsing anymore. So that was like, much nicer and much better to have a higher frequency. But then because I didn't get those exact shapes, so that was kind of a problem. No resolution. Walking on the streets in evenings, yes, I saw the street lights, kind of like a glimmer, nice bright glimmer every time when my eye hit the light. I also saw the lights from the shop windows. But still, unfortunately, it was not good enough to give me a good street view. I was not able to orientate just based on those signals of lights, because it was still kind of like not clear enough. So that was basically and also if I was sitting in a car with somebody driving in the city lights, it was just like lights everywhere. Every time when my eye hit the light, So but I didn't get a good location of a straight street, having a street lights on the other side of a street. I didn't really see the nice line of street lights. If I had been able to see that with the second chip, then of course it would have given me a good orientation, at least where the street goes. But shortly saying, the second one, it was not a real disappointment. I kind of used the chip until last year, pretty much before COVID really started hitting, 3-4 years I used it. I didn't get the good everyday benefits. It was mainly of a nice thing to have, nice toy to have to play around, especially when it was darker outside, because then I was able to get. And I also now it just came to my mind because I've talked about a contrast that I always required. Also with the second chip, if I used it during the daylight, or inside in the buildings where there's lots of light, I basically got nothing. I only saw white lights everywhere. So again, during the daylight, even with the second chip, I was not able to get orientation, or I didn't even see the objects that well. But when it was dark, in evenings, then everything was easier. And as far as I know, I don't think that was the case in every other second chip user. But in my case, I required high contrast. At least my retinal condition, for some reason, required that one. So comparing the second one and the first one, yes, the first one was kind of better, you could say, because I was able to recognize the shapes. But the second one I even preferred more because it was a higher frequency. Things that I looked at, they were not flickering. They looked a little more natural. But unfortunately, because I didn't get the shapes of things on a table or buildings or anything, not even the straight lines of a building. So it was not really useful. But it was not disappointment personally. I was realistic. I kind of knew what to expect. And I think one of the big reasons was that my retinal condition, it was 6, 7, 8 years worse than with the first chip, because the chip was supposed to be quite similar. But of course there are differences in technologically wise. I don't know all the details about those ones, but theoretically, the second chip should have given me quite similar results than the first one, but it didn't. And no one really seemed to know the exact answers why that took place. But again, with these higher frequencies from 6 hertz to 10 or 20, in my opinion, the higher the hertzes go, that would be more interesting for the future developments. Because then when it goes to over 20, the steadier all the images are, as far as I understand it. With the second chip, I once even tested very shortly in a controlled computer screen situation. I tested 50 hertz. And that was nice because I was able to see the movement on the computer screen. The lines were going from right to left, from left to right, and I was able to see the steady movement. So I noticed that, okay, now it's going to the left, now it's going to the right, now it's going up, now it's going up, down, because the 50 hertz gave me a pretty nice and steady image, even though the resolution was poor. And if I remember, the old normal TVs used 50 hertz for decades. Nowadays they use higher, but so that's one thing for the future development. Then just this morning I was asked an interesting question about what would I prefer? Which one would I prefer more in the future based on my experience? One, to have a good overall street view for better orientation, or two, have a good higher resolution, facial recognition, reading ability. And that's an interesting one from my point of view. 10, 15 years ago, I would have definitely said facial recognition, reading ability, seeing something very nice and sharp. Yes, definitely. But based on my experiences during the last 15 years, now I would say the street view for orientation, to have a better understanding where the buildings are, where the street is, where's the next building, okay, there's a street between those two buildings, something like that. Seeing something small, letters or something, that's, in my opinion, it's not that important. But again, of course, if the future technology with visual prostheses and artificial seeing, if it can give close to the normal eyesight, normal vision, then yes, of course, facial recognition reading. But if it's as slow as I had it, even though I recognize things in front of me on a table and different things on a computer screen, but it was still slow, much slower than normal seeing. So then it was like a nice toy, but for everyday use, it would have been way too slow. Like, for example, if I get any kind of a shop receipt, small text with artificial seeing, if it takes me like 2 minutes to slowly try to scan, come on, what's the big thing? Nowadays I can use just like an iPhone, any free app. I just show the shop receipt to the camera and it tells me in 1 second, reads me out loud all the text on a shop receipt. And that's the same thing with many of these, getting to know the facial recognition, reading ability with artificial seeing. Yes, if it's close to the normal vision, then it would be perfect. But if it's still clumsy, if it's still slow, then today's technology with identifying small things and reading the text from the paper, or even recognizing the different color of clothing like red, white, blue, all these apps can do it in a second. Just show the camera to the clothing and it tells you, okay, this is a white shirt, this is a blue shirt. I don't need an artificial seeing to help me through that. So that's why, with my experience today, I would say that a street view, having a larger spatial resolution, that would be nicer and more useful based on my experiences with 2 different chips. And then just for the conclusion part of it at the moment, so we can leave some time for the questions. One kind of an interesting thing is Professor Zrenner also touched the topic a little bit. So it seems to be so difficult with artificial seeing because every retina is so different. Every case is so different. So how to make it identical from the commercial point of view? Yes, of course, that's definitely a big question to the science or the industry in the future. And it's not going to be easy to copy, even though all the technical things show that the artificial implant is similar with every patient. But then because every patient is different, and it's not that easy to identify the differences in people's retinas. even though there are science people know that there are many, many ways of doing it, but then it's still not the same of how we see it through our poor vision or limited or no vision at all. And then about this one last comment that I would say, because we have many science people here around, so about the neuroscience kind of a point of view, I go back to the late 1990s, okay, when I took the visual field testing or acuity testing back home. All doctors told me at that time that you guys, just don't see anything anymore, that you're blind. Because all the testing showed that I cannot really see anything. But still, I was able to see, in my opinion, even read something. Even though all the visual field testing said, okay, come on, you cannot see. But yes, I was still able to walk on the streets all by myself. And I kind of thought about it this way, that as long as I had the smallest of window left on any part of my visual field, central or peripheral, then the brain's adaptation skills are quite remarkable. They just tried to make me a full picture. Quite long, and that lasted at least 2 or 3 years if I remember, because all the official like a medical testing showed that I cannot really see anything. How can you walk around all by yourself? Because based on our testing, you cannot see anything anymore. So that was quite interesting, just from the personal point of view. So that's how it is for the future. Industry, technology, science. I don't know which one is better. Having the facial recognition, reading ability, or having the higher, larger understanding of the surroundings. There are advantages and disadvantages in both ways of approaching this kind of a problem. That's pretty much it from my part today. Thank you very much for listening, and it may be even easier if you have more specific questions, so I can elaborate a little bit what I just told you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Miikka. We do have time for questions. Before we start with a question, Miikka was kind enough to bring a retina implant chip with him so that he can look at it. I'll pass this around. And the second thing I want to say to Constance Cepko, our next speaker, who is already listening in, that she should please turn on her camera so that we can get everything set up. So please, your questions.
Hi, thank you for sharing your experience. It's really important for us. My question is, did you receive some therapies, pharmacological therapies for your disease? Because probably at this point it's also important to stop or decrease the degeneration of the retina.
No, I never got any therapy or something. So I don't know. It was not recommended to me, and if it had been, I would have not been interested in it. Probably that's because of me, not because of the therapists. But I know I never had that one. By the way, with your question, do you mean before I entered the Tübingen projects or during the Tübingen projects? Which one do you mean?
Before and also during.
No, okay. I never got anything like no, because I never felt, even when I noticed that my eyesight starts going down as a young adult, I never felt any depression or anything. I never needed any therapy, or I was just like being a lone soldier, so to speak. I was coping it with myself. I didn't really need any outside extra. I was just like going week by week, month after month after month, until it reached the point that I was not really able to function properly anymore.
Thank you very much. It was frankly very inspiring talk from a scientific perspective. I was actually wondering, maybe the medical counseling can also help us in that question. So you said that you lost the central part of vision, but actually the chip is implanted near the central part of the retina that gives you the visual acuity. So I was wondering if, in that sense, either the chip helped like recollecting some central vision, or the chip was actually implanted more sidewise in your case, that you have the inverted disease?
Probably one thing with the first chip, I think the location must have been very, very ideal, I think. And perhaps I still had some sleeping photoreceptors left pretty much in the right location. That's also one possibility, because my results in a pilot study 2008, they were much, much better than the 10 persons before me. So, but I don't think anyone knows the real reason why my results were better than the others at the time. And to your question, I really don't know about this sideways kind of a thing. Professor Zrenner definitely has more knowledge about the surgical aspects of the chip.
Yeah, thank you for the question. We always looked for remaining pigment epithelium because that's then the part where the photoreceptors are gone, so to say, the last. And surprisingly, Miikka had in the center still pretty well preserved pigment epithelium. So our hypothesis is that the outer segments were gone, so it didn't work, but the inner segments, there are papers actually, can survive longer. And at that time, we were not able to see them in OCT or in any other imaging technique. Now we could, and we do. We did actually for the last 2-3 years when it was active. We had a small percentage of patients who still had inner segment. And that's of course ideal because then the first synapse between photoreceptors and bipolar cells together with the horizontal cell connection, the so-called triad synapse, is still working. And so that may have been a reason for the outstanding results.
Thank you for those comments. That was great. I was pleased to hear that you heard the question about, you were asked about the central high acuity perception versus a large picture perception, because that was put together by a couple of students working with me at Stanford. And I'm glad to hear that the informal survey reached you. And I was very interested to hear that question and your answer to that. In particular, I wanted to ask you, however, you mentioned in your answer to that question practical measures like street view, navigating, seeing a receipt, the color of somebody's clothes. And my question for you is there a different angle on this that has to do with the emotional significance of seeing things? Seeing the face of somebody you love and seeing their facial expressions, seeing beauty, aesthetic things like that. Does any of that come into your thinking?
Of course, I mean, to seeing the beauty and facial recognition and everything, if any kind of artificial seeing can provide even close to the normal seeing, yes. But with this kind of experiences that I had with chips, I'm not, even if there would be a pretty face, with that chip, it would have not been pretty anyway, because it would have been broken. So I would have not been able to get the real sense of a beauty. So from the emotional point of view, I really don't know. There might be differences between people. Some appreciate things and some appreciate something else, but I cannot really, I don't know how to answer to that one. I don't have an opinion.
So Professor Zrenner already told us he's eager to work on a third generation of his chips. Would you be willing to go for a third round?
Why not? I mean, that would be great. I mean, I entered the project in the first place not for my personal reasons. I had accepted my blindness, my eye problems. I had coped in my life quite well without seeing for the last 10, 15 years. I had nothing to complain. I was not desperate to get the eyesight back. That was never the reason that I entered. I just wanted to do it for the science. No matter if it helps me, but if it helps the others. And it was so interesting to enter to the science world, to get to know it a little bit more. So yes, the first one and the second one, I was the human guinea pig. Why wouldn't I be there for the third time? Yeah, definitely.
Hi, thank you for your sharing your experience. You know that the brain territory which process vision will be also used maybe for other sensory modality if it is not used as if it's not really stimulated. So I have a different question. Did you add some weird sensation, maybe having like tactile stimulation or auditory stimulation when trying to see with these retinal implants? And maybe did you add the feeling that your visual memory was fading? And did you add brain training maybe to train your vision abilities?
No, I never had a visual training of any kind. I've never had it, not during the project, not before the project. Using the chip, I don't remember getting any kind of outside images, if that's what your question meant. I didn't get any side effects of side visual, no, I cannot recall that. About the visual memory, I think that's an interesting topic, because even during my 2008, I always thought, did the microphone go? Oh, no, it's on. I always thought that I have a very good visual memory. I cannot compare it to the others, of course. But it might have helped me, to understand the shapes of objects easier. Because I always, even today, I've been blind for 15 something, 18, 17, 20 years. I still feel that I see things. I visualize everything. If I go to a restaurant, if I go to a new place, if I'm in a familiar place, I always feel after a couple of minutes that I see things. And I don't do it intentionally. My brain just tries to give me feeling of a picture all the time. And still the visual memory, in learning to see with any kind of a device, I think if a person has had a visual mind earlier in his or her life, it's going to help a lot. in order to learn how to see again. But I don't know any scientific backing for that, but this is just my own opinion.
So we have time for one more question.
Miikka, you said that you needed very high contrast to see, and particularly well, I think in all examples, was a light object on a dark background.
Mm-hmm.
Were you able to see dark objects on a bright background?
Not as well. That didn't work as well. It was definitely much better with the black background. Because that was also the same thing in the like late 1990s when I was still able to, I was not able to read the newspaper anymore because of white background, black letters, but the same smallest fonts, I was still able to see them on a computer screen, read them on a computer screen, because I changed my computer screen to the black background and white letters. So for me, it always worked much, much better, the contrast. Black background, white letters. And even in the very last times when I was able to read the normal text, I never needed any eyeglasses. Magnifying the text never helped. I was able to see the normal 10, 12 basis point font on a computer screen until the window closed in the center of my eye completely. But only if the background was black.
Okay, let's thank Miikka again for this. You already see her on screen. We have Constance Cepko from Harvard University. She's also a member of the National Academy of Sciences. Connie is a developmental biologist and geneticist who has worked for a long time on retinal development, how genes and gene products interact so that at the end you have a functional retina during development. And many of these same genes are also involved in retinal diseases, so when something goes wrong. And it was a natural step in her research to also work on diseases and how to treat them. And today, she will talk about her latest works, looking into various possibilities to help the retina to survive longer during disease. Connie, I'd like to thank you very much for talking here today. I'm looking forward to your presentation. Let's just quickly make sure that all the technical things work. Can you unmute your microphone that we can hear you?
How's this? Can you hear?
Yes, I can hear. And let's see if we get a thumbs up from the other people. Wonderful. So please go ahead.
How's this? Can you see it right?
Yes.
Okay, so this first slide shows the photoreceptor. This is an example of a cone photoreceptor in a mouse retina. And I like to show this picture because it is the cell type that we're trying to preserve with all our therapies. It's absolutely essential for the initiation of vision. Many of you know this, but I'll just give a quick introduction. This reconstruction was done by Claudio Punzo when he was a postdoc in the lab. And what we have out here, can you see my cursor? Is that all right? This has the phototransduction machinery.
So it would be easier to see. It would be easier to see, Connie, if you turn on this laser pointer feature, I think.
How's that?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. So this outer segment then is where light is captured and processed. This inner segment is where really all the machinery for metabolism is housed, for making proteins. Mitochondria are very dense here, so energy production. And then this is the nucleus with a very thin shell of cytoplasm. So what we're trying to do is to preserve all of these structures, or at least the function in terms of reception and processing of light information. And I'll also point out that this red stain here in the inner segment is an antibody stain for the phosphorylation epitope of mTOR. I'll come back to that, but mTOR phosphorylation is read out as a sign of the metabolic state of a cell. So when the phosphorylation is on, the cell is healthy, able to make RNA and protein and function. And when this is absent, it's generally a sign that something is amiss, perhaps not enough nutrients, growth factor signaling might be down, et cetera. So our goal then is to preserve the function, in particular of the cone photoreceptors. Those are the ones that are responsible for our daylight and high acuity vision. Now, unfortunately, vision is very susceptible to mutations that can affect either specifically the photoreceptors or more generally other cell types in the body. But many, many genes, I think we're well over 200 now, can lead to loss of vision. And some of the names of the diseases are shown here: retinitis pigmentosa, as you just heard, cone rod dystrophy, macular degeneration. And what's also listed here is some of the disease genes. For retinitis pigmentosa, I think we're over 100 now. And interestingly, some of the disease genes that cause one disease, for example, retinitis pigmentosa, may also cause other diseases. What we're hoping is that by addressing any one of these diseases, but in our case, retinitis pigmentosa, will actually be effective for other diseases. And I'll give you some examples of that. Now, I'll tell you more about retinitis pigmentosa, but we chose this one because it can be well modeled in mice. Either naturally occurring mutations in mice or engineered mutations in mice have a disease which follows generally the same kind of processes as we see in humans. So we're targeting retinitis pigmentosa in mice, but again, we're hoping that first of all, it will be relevant for humans, but secondly, it will also be relevant for other diseases where vision is lost. So the disease affects about 1 in 3,000 people in our country, I think also in Europe. It's inherited most of the time that we can track it, it's inherited. The onset of loss of color vision depends at least in part on the mutation, but also other factors that we don't really have a handle on. Very importantly, as I'll tell you, the genes that are involved are rod specific, meaning they're only expressed in the rod photoreceptors. Now, the rod photoreceptors are those that are sensitive in dim light conditions. So for our night vision, we use our rods. Again, for daylight and color vision and high acuity vision, we're using our cones. So we value our cone vision much more than our rod vision. And interestingly, the rods are often the cell type, the only cell type in the body, not even cones, but the rods express many of these disease genes. And that explains the pathology. That is, the onset of the disease symptoms are night blindness. And that's again because the rods are not functioning properly. It can result in tunnel vision. That is, peripheral color vision is lost first and last in the very center. And the very center is our area with only cones. And that gives us, for various reasons, our high acuity vision. And it can result in total blindness. Now, right now, you heard about a therapy, but there are very few therapies for this disease. So this is a very simple cartoon laying out what is happening. Here is the cell death rate on the y-axis and the loss of different types of vision here on the x over time. So because, again, the disease genes affect the rod function directly, the rods are not able to transduce light properly, and there's poor night vision. But secondarily, the rods then die. Now, why do they die? We're not certain. It may be different for different disease genes. Some of the disease genes affect transcription, some affect phototransduction, some affect transport, some affect structure overall. So it's probably different reasons for rod death in the different disease gene cases, but at some point, the rods start to die. And at least in mice, we charted this in 4 different mouse models of RP, and we counted how many rods are left over time. And this time course can vary greatly depending on the mutation. So this then is loss of night vision. Now, the tragedy of the disease is it leads to loss of cone vision. So cones then die, as bystanders. They don't express the disease gene. So it's not that the disease gene is functioning normally in normal cones and then they lose that function. They are reading out somehow problems that are caused by rod death. And again, when we charted this, the cones start to die when a great majority of the rods in their immediate neighborhood die. And there is some progression across sort of the geography of the visual field. And I've been told by ophthalmologists it can vary among patients, but generally it's more peripheral than central. And eventually, again, it can affect the central vision. So our goal is to prevent the cone death by introducing gene therapy vectors at the point where a person is losing their cone vision. Now, it would help a lot in terms of our strategy if we understood why the cones were dying. We don't know. Our hope is that it's generic. That is, regardless of the reason that causes rod death in the different disease gene cases, that the outcome in terms of cone death or the reasons for the cone death are shared across disease gene families. That's a hypothesis, and we have that hypothesis because it seems that there is a commonality here. Again, at least in the mice, if we chart, when do the cones start to die? It's always when the majority, 90% even, of the rods in their immediate neighborhood die. Now, we and others in our field have some hypotheses about why are the cones dying. We know there's oxidative stress. This can be measured in people as well as animal models. Presumably, it's because of the rods being the major cell type in the retina. So in humans as well as in mice, they're 95% of the cells in the outer nuclear layer. That's the area of the retina where the photoreceptors reside. And the eye is extremely well, the oxygen level in the eye is very high. So when the rods die, I've been told that the oxygen keeps coming in from the vascular network on the outside of the retina, the choroid, at about the same rate as if rods are present. So lots of oxygen's coming in, light is coming in. It can create free radicals, which can then lead to oxidative damage to many different species. So we know that's happening. Our question was whether it's causal. We found through some work in our lab that there's metabolic problems, which I'll come back to. Inflammation accompanies pretty much every disease that I know of, and it as well accompanies these ocular diseases. But neurodegeneration in general has inflammation as a fairly prominent phenotype. So if these are the problems that are being experienced by the cones, one can imagine that they're not functioning very well and they die. There's probably other problems. For example, there's structural collapse in the area of the outer segments, the inner segments, and the cell bodies. This could be leading to some of these problems or independent problems. So we're trying to then develop viral vectors, AAV viruses, which can deliver genes, which fight against these various problems. And we think they're going to have to be delivered in combination because, again, we think more than one problem exists for these cones. So I'll first tell you about our efforts to fight oxidative stress. So first, I'll tell you our method. So again, we're using mice and AAV viruses. A little bit unusually, we're actually delivering the viruses to the postnatal day 0 or newborn animals. And we're doing that for a few reasons. We're injecting viruses into the subretinal space, and we know we cause damage when we do that. But these young animals can heal the damage quite well. So that's nice. More importantly, when we inject at this stage, it's before the retina has formed processes with the support layer, the RPE. And the subretinal space doesn't have a lot of interactions between those kinds of processes of the RPE and photoreceptor outer segments. The photoreceptor outer segments don't exist yet. And so the inoculum flows through the entire subretinal space. So we're able to get infection of all of the RPE cells as well as the photoreceptors, particularly the cone photoreceptors, which are sitting there right at that surface. So we can efficiently infect all of the cells. And because of the efficiency and the concentration of virus we inject, we can actually get co-infection of 2 to 5 virus particles at the same inoculation. So this allows us, again, to mix and match different genes which are carried by these viruses. Now, one gene we typically put in, is represented by this green virus, has a cone promoter representing the cone opsin gene that drives a nuclear form of GFP called H2B GFP. We deliver that because it gives us the ability to count the remaining cones fairly easily. We can do this in an automated fashion because the nuclear expression of this GFP protein is very bright. So this one's always delivered as either a control, it's the only virus that goes into one of the eyes of the animal, or in combination with potentially therapeutic genes, allowing us again to count the readout of the nuclear GFP. So we deliver at postnatal day 0, and then depending on the animal model, we're using 3 different animal models. We let the animal grow up, and then we take time points when there's the onset or the ongoing cone degeneration. We take out the retina or the RPE as a sheet. We flatten it out. We then count the cones. Now, in the mouse model, the cones die first in the central retinal and then more peripherally. So we count at different locations, again, with these automated counting, and that gives us a number of cones surviving. We also assay visual acuity with the optomotor test, which we're now using the Striatech optodrum for an automated counting. It's just a huge boon for us. So by doing this with potential disease genes, or sorry, therapeutic genes across 3 different animal models, we're hoping to find a combination of genes that will give a generic survival and functional recovery in these disease models. And again, it's important to us that we test in more than one animal model because we're trying to have something which is fairly generic. So this is an example of a flat mount diseased retina treated with a GFP only control. Now I should have a wild type in here to show you, but usually the retina has this density of cones throughout. Here you can see there's been a loss of cones in the central retina. That's at a particular time point in our fastest model called the RD1 model. And the peripheral cones you can see are still surviving. And I'm going to come back to this, but here you can see that there's a fairly sharp demarcation. It's not gradual in terms of the loss of cones. If we treat with vectors that fight oxidative damage, we can preserve many of those central cones. And again, we can count those, and I can show you some of the data from that here. So this is the age of the animal, and this is the cone density at different locations. So in the green line, I'm showing you the control treated GFP eye. You can see we're losing the number of cones very rapidly from the interval of postnatal day 35 to 50 in this model. We put in 2 transcription factors that can turn on genes which fight oxidative damage. One of them is called PGC1 alpha, and one is called NRF2 or NRF2. Both of these have many genes, hundreds of genes as targets. They directly turn on genes, and NRF2, interestingly, can also lead to repression of inflammatory genes. And you can see that for reasons unknown to us, the PGC1 alpha is deleterious to cones, whereas the NRF2 is beneficial for cones. And that's a more durable effect. We can see this out to postnatal day 70. If we put in SOD2 and catalase, which are 2 enzymes which can detox free radicals, we also can preserve cones, but the effect is not as long lasting as that of NRF2. So NRF2 was our best candidate for preserving cone vision and cone number out to later stages in the degeneration. Now, I told you that we also use a measure of vision, and that's the optomotor assay. And I'll call your attention to this top right image. These are ages, again, of the animal. Green is a GFP injected control, and white is uninjected. This is acuity over here. And the NRF2 is these orange or brown symbols. And you can see that we've not only preserved cone number, but also vision by virtue of this assay. So this is something we're pretty happy with in terms of the NRF2 function. We haven't found anything deleterious if we inject wild type mice. Now we're hoping that it will extend to age-related macular degeneration. Some of you know that this disease is really one of the most common. It affects quite a few people. It's age-related. It has a high percentage of people over 75, depending on which assay or which data you read. It could be 25% of people over 75, and it affects our central vision. It's going up as our population ages. It's got a very high cost. We think that the cost will, again, just keep going up. For the dry AMD, which is the most common form, we really don't have effective therapies. There's been a recently approved gene therapy, but in general, I would say we don't really have an effective therapy. There's also a wet form, which many of you may have heard of, where there's leakage of blood vessels, and that can be suppressed by injection of anti-VEGF. So wet AMD, which again is about 10% of people, can be slowed down and sometimes improved by these injections. But we don't have that type of therapy for the dry AMD. And for those of you who are interested, one of the correlates to this disease is the accumulation of these deposits called drusen. So we know a bit about this disease from human genetics. There are disease genes which give you a higher percent or a higher likelihood of getting the disease, but there's no deterministic genes as there is in retinitis pigmentosa. In other words, in RP, if you have one of the disease genes, you will get the disease. Here, you just have an increased probability. It makes it a little harder to study, and it's very hard to study because we don't have good animal models. That is, the central retina in humans is where our high acuity vision is located in the area called the macula, which also is the area which includes the fovea, our high acuity area. And we don't have that in our animal models. So we can't really study the mechanism of the disease process. We know from human data that the retinitis, the RPE, the support layer, the retinal pigment epithelium, often appears to be affected first in the disease, secondarily the photoreceptors. So we thought perhaps we could look at our mouse models of retinitis pigmentosa to see if the RPE is suffering and if we could address those problems, again, with the vectors that we developed to save the photoreceptors. So just to give you a little visual here, this is a cartoon of the cones and the rods. Again, rods are by far the more abundant photoreceptor. In humans, 95%. And these colored cells then represent the cone photoreceptors. A single RPE cell can provide support for many, it could be anywhere from 20 to 100 photoreceptors. They have these villi, which project into the retina and surround very intimately these outer segments of the photoreceptors. And there's exchange of nutrients and waste products among these cells. Out here, the choroid supplies oxygen and a lot of nutrients and also helps with waste removal. So these large RPE cells have these microvilli. These then we found deteriorate during the progression of retinitis pigmentosa. And we were hoping to preserve those by delivering NRF2 to the RPE and using a promoter which expresses only in the RPE. So the previous data I showed you expressed in both the RPE and the photoreceptors. Now we're testing, can we preserve RPE by delivering NRF2 and having it express only in the RPE? So first to show you some tissues. So the wild type RPE tissue, this is now what we call flat mouse. So we're looking at the apical surface, the surface facing the photoreceptors. And we have a stain which highlights the boundaries of the RPE called phalloidin. It's looking at actin bundles. And you can see the regularity here. It's a very nice hexagonal array. In one of our mutants, the RD1 mutant, we've lost that regular array, and eventually we lose the RPE altogether. You can see it's quite disordered. Now, if we deliver the NRF2 with the best one promoter, which is only expressing NRF2 in the RPE, we get back this beautiful hexagonal array. Similarly, another promoter, CMV, we can preserve a lot of the nice regular array. We also looked at the EM level to see how the microvilli were faring. So this is a control RPE layer, and you can see that there's no regularity, there's no microvilli. When we put in the NRF2, we can preserve those microvilli, which are shown here. So this is almost a wild type level of the microvilli, meaning we hope that the RPE can continue to supply the support functions through the better structure here of the RPE. So just to summarize what we've done with NRF2, it's an antioxidative damage therapy. We actually looked at the oxidized products following NRF2 therapy, and they are indeed reduced. We also looked at RNA-seq, and we found that many of the genes anticipated to be upregulated by NRF2 were upregulated. It's also an anti-inflammation therapy, which we're hoping this is kind of a twofer, a win-win here with two different mechanisms. We found many of the genes that changed, again, as viewed through RNA-seq, had to do with metabolism. Using promoters that are specific, we can express it only in the RPE, which I just showed you. We're hoping that this might make it a good therapy for AMD. We can express it in both cones and the RPE, which is the first data I showed you. And importantly, the people who did this work, Wenjun Zhang, who now has her own lab at the City University of Hong Kong, and David Wu, who has his own lab at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary. So this is now one of our leading genes to take forward for clinical trials. Now I'd like to switch to another mechanism, inflammation. So Sean Wang, who was a medical student in the lab, and interestingly, he was one of the Forbes 30 under 30 people recognized for their potential. He's now an ophthalmologist in training at Stanford. Sean was very interested in the immune system's reaction during retinitis pigmentosa, and he focused on microglia, the macrophages of the central nervous system. So microglia have many functions, and it's not clear always whether they're good or bad, or they change over the course of a disease. In normal development, they can carry out phagocytosis of synaptic areas. They can also carry out phagocytosis of cells. They can participate in inciting programmed cell death. So several different functions. They're studied pretty intensively, particularly in other neurodegenerative diseases. We weren't clear on what their function might be during the course of RP. Now, because of the work that's been ongoing in many different areas, there was a number of interactions between neurons and microglia that had been elucidated. And some of those are represented here, and this is what Sean was looking at in terms of functional perturbations that he could carry out with gene therapy between microglia and cones or other neurons during the course of RP in mice. So you can see here, these are receptors on the microglia, some of which are giving signals like calm down or don't eat me. On the part of the neuron, the ligands for these receptors can be upregulated again in normal development or during the course of disease. So Sean perturbed the signaling either from the microglia side or the neuron side using AAV vectors, and some of them then preserved cones and others did not. So just to summarize, and I'll show you a bit of the data, one of the molecules on the neuron surface is called fractalkine, and it can be either secreted or membrane bound. So he expressed both forms, and the secreted ended up preserving the cones. Another one's called CD47, which some of you may know is quite famous now because it's one of the ones that is used by tumors to prevent engulfment by macrophages. So it's a don't eat me signal. And on the microglia side, it can work through either one of two receptors, SIRP-alpha or thrombospondin. Another signal is TGF-beta1. It can be secreted and it can work through receptors, TGF-beta receptor 1 or 2 complex on the surface of microglia. We also expressed CD200 on the surface of neurons, and this one did not work. And the fractalkine on the surface of the cones also did not work. So this is just a summary of a couple of years of work by Sean. I'll summarize and tell you a little bit more about his work. So first, he looked at where are the microglia during the course of photoreceptor degeneration. This is a cross-section through a retinitis pigmentosa model, and the green shows you the location of the microglia. They're out here in the outer nuclear layer, which is at this stage in the disease, just a single layer of cones. Normally, they do not reside in the outer nuclear layer, so they move into that layer and they appear to be greater in number during the course of the disease. So that positions them in a place where they could eat the cones or otherwise harm the cones. But interestingly, he could treat the mice with a drug which eliminates the microglia, and it did not improve the microglia survival, at least at the period of time we looked, and now we need to look a little longer. But we were kind of shocked that the microglia sitting right next to the cones, where again, we thought they might be carrying out a deleterious effect, did not seem to lead to cone survival improvement if we got rid of them. To be continued. We did, however, have these treatments which preserve the cone's survival and their function as viewed through optomotor. So secreted fractalkine, secreted TGF-beta1, cell surface bound CD47, all improved cone survival. And again, we tested across multiple models. Looking at the optomotor, they all improved vision. And now we're trying to understand how do they work. If they're not working through microglia, at least in the case of secreted fractalkine and TGF-beta1, they don't need microglia to work. We eliminated the microglia, we put in the vectors, they still promoted survival. So, CD47 and secreted fractalkine, TGF-beta1 did need microglia. So we're trying to understand who are they signaling, what molecule, what cell type. And that's ongoing. So then we have vectors that can fight inflammation and oxidative stress. We then looked at metabolic problems. And again, we're asking this basic question. At the start of our work, this is more than 10 years ago, Claudio Punzo was a postdoc in the lab, and we decided to look in an unbiased way at what RNA changes happen in 4 different mouse models. And our goal was to look at what are the common gene expression problems or changes at the moment when the cones start to die. And these 4 different models have different time courses. So some are very fast, some are very slow, and they have different disease genes. So again, we're looking for a common signature that leads to cone death. And we did that with RNA expression. And we found there was a common signature, and it had to do with metabolism. And the insulin mTOR pathway is a regulator of metabolism, and this one was implicated. So we started looking at insulin mTOR signaling and other aspects of metabolism, and we thought there were changes. We didn't know if those problems that we saw were causal or not. So we started trying to perturb or help metabolism in cones to see if it would preserve them. Now, what might be going on that would create metabolic problems? So here's this cartoon again, where you see the RPE and photoreceptors. As the rods die, there's an actual collapse of the outer nuclear layer and the cone outer segments. And this interaction, we think, might be disrupted, perhaps impeding nutrient flow from the RPE to the cones. And one hypothesis is that it is glucose delivery. Photoreceptors are very metabolically active, and they rely on glucose as their primary fuel source. That's delivered initially through the choroid to the RPE, which delivers it to the photoreceptors. So our thinking was that this glucose delivery might be disrupted. So we then focused on how do we get more glucose to the cones. So we had sort of a crazy idea initially, and that was to ask the cones to make their own glucose, to no longer rely on the supply coming in from the RPE. Now, normally, cones can't make their own glucose. And really, the only cell types in the body that can are in the liver. And the way gluconeogenesis, the synthesis of glucose, works is by using some of the enzymes that break it down in glycolysis. So this is the glycolytic pathway. There are a number of enzyme steps here. 3 of them are energetically uphill to go from small molecule starting points back to glucose. So these 3 enzymes are not expressed in the retina or most other cells in the body, but they are expressed in the liver. And they can use as a starting point pyruvate or gluconeogenic amino acids. Now, the cones have lactose or lactate transporters. So it's possible they could take up lactate from other sources, for example, Mueller glia, or maybe even the RPE or the vasculature. So we thought perhaps there would be a source of starting material. And if we supplied these 3 rate-limiting enzymes, the endogenous glycolytic enzymes would still be there, and the cones could make their own glucose. So this was carried out by Yashchin Shori, a postdoc in the lab, delivering these 3 enzymes, the genes encoding them through AAV. And these are the cone counts from that study. So again, GFP positive cones in the center or the periphery. So at this stage in the disease, there's very few cones left in the center. There's a few more in the periphery, but the GFP doesn't really preserve anything. This looks like untreated. For reference, here's the NRF2. We get about a doubling of the cones in the center or the periphery. And these 3 gluconeogenic enzymes give us a similar rescue. Now, we thought the effects might be additive because the gluconeogenic enzymes are giving the cones more glucose, we hope. And the NRF2 is fighting other problems, oxidative damage, perhaps inflammation. So we reasoned that they should be additive. And indeed they were. Here's delivery of 4 different genes through AAV, and we get an additive bonus to survival, similarly in the periphery. So this is, again, going back to what I introduced to you, that there are multiple problems, and we think we are going to need to combat more than one problem. We then took a broader survey of metabolic perturbations delivered by AAV. This was taken up by Sawyer Xu in the lab when he became a postdoc. He now has his own lab in China at the Lin Gang laboratory. So Sawyer thought about many different aspects of glycolysis, which again is using glucose, and it is the main fuel source for cones. And he thought perhaps some of the glycolytic enzymes were not in the right amount or ratio. Maybe the glucose transporter wasn't there. There was work that RDCVF a secreted molecule can boost cone survival. This is work from Sahel's group. So he put in a number of different genes. He surveyed about 20 genes that had something to do with glucose metabolism and asked, does it boost cone survival? And those numbers are shown here. And really, there was only one winner, a gene called TXNP, expressed directly in the cones using a cone promoter. So I'll tell you some of the data from that. What he found was that it appeared to switch the preference of the fuel source in cones. So rather than using glucose, and again, glucose comes in through the glucose transporter and goes through glycolysis, instead, based on a study of TXNP in muscle, we looked at alternative fuel sources, one of which was lactate, another was ketone bodies, another was fatty acids. And we asked if TXNP boosts cone survival by switching them to either lactate, ketone bodies, or fatty acid. And to do this, we did a genetic loss of function. We put in TXNP along with an shRNA, which knocks down the enzyme LDHB, which converts lactate to pyruvate. So lactate being converted to pyruvate makes pyruvate available to go in and fuel the TCA cycle in mitochondria or participate in other reactions. So by knocking down LDHB, when we add TXNP, we lost the rescue by TXNP. So this is a genetic proof that lactate is being used for the benefit of cones when TXNP is present, and we don't really know the mechanism by which that happens. We also saw that mitochondria were greatly improved in terms of number and function. We probed function a number of ways. We did EM on mitochondrial structure. So there is another benefit, which is to mitochondria, and we don't know if that's indirect through pyruvate or some other mechanism. So TXNP then is one of our leading candidates to boost mitochondrial health and overall metabolism or health in the cones. And again, we hope this is complementary or additive to some of the other therapies for oxidative damage or inflammation. The last study I'll tell you about was having to do with preserved cones in our 3 mouse models. Over the years, we found that the dorsal peripheral cones lived much longer than the other cones, particularly the central ones, but even the periphery in the ventral and the anterior posterior leaflets. So this is a wild type mouse, flat mount of the retina, looking at cone arrestin, and you can see the nice dense photoreceptors here. If we look at the RD1 mouse at postnatal day 40, again, the peripheral cones are more preserved. And I won't show you, but we've published this. If we even look a year later, there's still more dorsal cones than anywhere else. And we saw this in our 3 mouse models. And so we were wondering, as a basic science question, what preserves those dorsal cones? And if we could learn what that was, we might also be able to develop a therapy. So this was the work of Ryoji Yamamoto when he was a postdoc in the lab, and he also has his own lab now at the Mass Eye and Ear. So Ryoji took a molecular approach, again using RNA. So he took samples from the center and the periphery, and then he isolated the cones. It turned out they were contaminated with some Mueller glia, which turned out to be fortuitous. He carried out RNA-seq on those peripheral cones, and he compared to the RNA in the more central cones. And he found some interesting differences. Principally, the retinoic acid synthetic pathway was enriched in the periphery. So this retinoic acid signaling pathway is an amazingly effective way to turn on or keep off a lot of genes. Retinoic acid is used as a signaling molecule prominently in development and throughout life in many different tissues. And one can assay where is the retinoic acid signaling. It has a receptor that can bind the small molecule. And you could ask, where is that signaling taking place by having a reporter for the transcriptional activity of the receptor when RA is present. And that's what's shown here. So this is a mouse that shows LAC-Z where RA signaling is present by virtue of a target sequence called RARE driving LAC-Z. So this is a wild type mouse, and what you see is dorsal signaling a little bit more in the ventral, but not much here in the anterior posterior. So this showed us that not only were the synthetic enzymes for RA enriched in this region, signaling was enriched in this region. So then we wanted to know, well, is this important for cone survival? And there are 3 synthetic enzymes for retinoic acid, ALDH1A1, 2, and 3. 1A1 is the one that we found was enriched in the dorsal retina, but we decided to get mice from colleagues where there were floxed alleles or conditional deletions of all 3 of these enzymes. And we could remove them from the retina at a time point of our choosing by mating mice with all of these loss of function floxed alleles with something called the Cre-ER. And we bred those into the disease background RD1. So this was a very long breeding scheme to get 10 alleles into a mouse. But it was worth it. We could then turn on the loss of RA synthetic capacity by injecting tamoxifen, which activates the Cre. And we did that at postnatal day 10. And then we asked, in this animal that has the Cre, so it should lose synthetic capacity, versus the same animal without the Cre, do we lose cones in the dorsal retina? And the answer was yes. So this is cone counts where we don't turn on the loss of function. And here it is where we do. So by getting rid of RA synthetic capacity, we lose the extra cone survival in the dorsal retina. There's still some cones, but the extra cones that we see there normally, we have lost. So that tells us not only is the RA synthetic capacity present, signaling is present, and it's important to keep those cones alive. So then we wanted to know, is it sufficient to keep the cones alive? And again, we took a genetic approach. We delivered something, the receptor, RAR alpha, with a fusion domain, which makes it constitutively active. Without RA present, it just turns on the RA target genes, regardless of the presence of RA. And we put this into the retina, or as a control, we put in blue fluorescent protein, and then we counted cones. And what you can see is signaling by this receptor is sufficient to drive cone survival. That was true at postnatal day 40, and it was true at postnatal day 100. We still have the boost. So that makes it a potential therapeutic. So just to summarize this part of the talk, in a normal retina where we haven't perturbed the RA signaling pathway, in a degeneration model, we have excess cones relative to the rest of the retina in the dorsal periphery. If we take away the synthetic capacity, we've now lost those extra cones. And if we add RA signaling in patches, as we did with electroporation, we can get back more cone survival in other areas, not just dorsal periphery. So to summarize then, we think there's non-autonomous cone cell death by virtue of the gene expression patterns of these RP disease genes. We can fight oxidative stress with the transcription factor NRF2. We can address what we think is glucose shortages by putting in synthetic capacity for glucose or TIC-SNP to switch off of the glucose dependence in cones. We can fight inflammation with secreted fractalkine, secreted TGF-beta1, or the CD47 don't eat me signal on the surface of cones. And we can put in signaling via an activated retinoic acid receptor and preserve cones, not just in the dorsal retina, but elsewhere. So again, we're hoping to be able to combine these and take these forward with clinical trials. We've been fortunate to have funding from a number of sources. At the moment, we're working with Spark Therapeutics to try to develop these into therapies, and I've been very fortunate to have both HHMI and National Eye Institute funding throughout. So I'll stop there and be glad to take questions.
Thank you very much, Connie. And is the microphone on? Okay, and we're ready for questions. EJ? Or, oh, where do you have a microphone?
Yes, so my question is, two questions. Your whole approach is based on counting cones using CMV GFP, but CMV is not a cone promoter, it's a very promiscuous promoter that is expressed in every cell wherever the virus that carries it goes. So it's hard for me to understand how you are distinguishing between cones and any other type of cell since CMV is expressed everywhere. And the second question is regarding NRF2. What is the hypothesis behind it? How did you arrive at the idea that overexpression of NRF2 will be beneficial to stop the death of the cones? Thank you.
Connie,
sorry.
if you could unshare your screen so that you become full screen again and we can see you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You may have missed a little detail that I put in at the beginning. We're using a cone-specific promoter to drive the GFP. So it's the red opsin promoter that was initially developed by Don Zach, and it is indeed cone-specific. So we're only counting cones, and we've tested this. It's not expressed in any other cell type, only in cones. Maybe a faint amount in a small number of rods, but actually they're gone by the time we do our assays. So it is indeed cone-specific. In fact, we worry a little bit about it anyways as a readout. So more recently, we've been doing FISH, fluorescent in situ hybridization for cone arrestin. And we've compared our counts with the two different methods, and they agree. So we're pretty comfortable with our assay. The NRF2, you asked, how did we arrive at it? Well, again, in surveying the literature, we knew there was oxidative damage. And if you read about the enzymes or the genes that can fight oxidative damage, there are many pathways actually in the body for that. PGC1 alpha and NRF2 are transcription factors that turn on a lot of the genes. In fact, SOD2 and catalase, two enzymes that can detox free radicals, are target genes for NRF2 and PGC1 alpha. So we did all of them. We did SOD2 and catalase, we did NRF2, we did PGC1 alpha. I showed you some of the data of that in the beginning. NRF2 was the winner. There was also some previous data from Peter Campochiero's lab where they had made transgenic mice with SOD2 and catalase, and they also could preserve some cones in RD1, the mouse model we use. So we thought that those were good candidates, the SOD2 and catalase. But again, I showed you that it wasn't a very durable effect. So that's why we went to the transcription factors, thinking that there would be a broader, more long-lasting effect on the oxidative damage. Now, why we chose to overexpress NRF2, there's other ways you can manipulate NRF2 levels. You can knock down one of the negative regulators. So NRF2 is an interesting protein. It's synthesized by most cells at both the RNA and protein level. But the protein typically gets degraded by the activity of another protein called KEAP1, which directs it for ubiquitination and degradation by the proteasome. So another approach that some labs are taking is to knock down KEAP1. And there's other pathways that regulate NRF2 protein levels. But we thought, well, the simplest thing is to just go for overexpression. So we did that. It worked. And so we just kept on with that strategy.
I have a question about the replacing, endowing the cones with the ability to make their own glucose. From a naive point of view, it sounds like a very fundamental metabolic function to either make your own glucose or not. And so if you cause a cone to make its own glucose, could that have other bad effects downstream?
Yeah, I mean, possibly. I mean, we assay over several time points for both the optomotor response as well as the cone number. We did not see, generally, even with all of our therapies, and I think everybody's therapies I've seen published, all of the therapies that give greater cone survival or function all lose their effectiveness over time in these mouse models. And that's true for the gluconeogenic strategy as well. But we haven't seen any deleterious effects when we deliver to wild type mouse cones. Again, maybe if we assayed for years, there would be a problem, but so far we haven't seen anything that would indicate a problem. We just get better cone survival and better optomotor response. I mean, that's a true worry for all of the things we're doing, and I think everybody else's therapies as well, is could we be causing deleterious effects? And it's pretty much an empiric question right now. We haven't seen anything.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for an enormous amount of data and content. So my question would be, you said it in the beginning, retinal degeneration is a complex phenomenon. Even if it's monogenic, it's very complex, and in the progress of disease, it's getting even complexer. So we all work with mice at a given stage of age, and we use genetics, molecular genetics, as a sharp tool to intervene with a certain stage of retinal degeneration. If we move the whole thing to clinical trials, we have a different situation. We have patients of different age, of different progression of disease, of different background, which is not true for RD1 and RD10. So how would you deal with this level of complexity which increases once we enter from a preclinical proof of concept to clinical phase 1-2 studies?
Yeah, no, very good question. And I'm very much a rookie in this area, and I'm relying on Spark Therapeutics to help us with this. But theoretically, what I would say is that because I'm told by people who study humans that the onset and progression is quite patchy. So my hope is that a person who is starting to lose cone vision, and again, this even in a given family, again, I've learned that you can have individuals, siblings in a given family with the same disease gene have loss of their color vision occur very differently at different times. So I remember Ted Drija, when we first started doing this, told me a story that he was helping a family where the son in the family lost his color vision in his 20s, and the sister lost it in the 60s. So there's this very different time of onset and kinetics, even again with the same disease gene. I don't think we have an understanding of that. It could be modifier loci, it could be environmental, it could be both, it could be stochastic. So at any rate, when someone starts to lose their color vision, which can be assayed behaviorally or using vision assays, my hope is to be able to deliver the genes on the central side of a progressive loss of vision. So again, if it's patchy and it's happening more rapidly, let's say in the ventral periphery, to do the inoculation before the central vision is gone, and to deliver the virus, which we can't get full coverage in the human eye. We can only get a bleb, we call it, but an area of delivery of about, let's say, 15%. So to deliver that on the central side of a progressing loss of color vision sort of patch. And exactly how effective that will be, I suspect, given the genetic heterogeneity and the other kinds of heterogeneity in the human population, it's not going to work for everybody. Our hope is it will slow it down at least, and that other ways of delivering might give us even the ability to do a greater patch size or more patches. And that's my hope. Again, I hope to be led through this by Spark Therapeutics. They are the company that has Luxturna. So they have good experience with the clinical trial design and assays. So we'll just see how it goes. But I don't think we're going to cure people with this. This is really something that's treating the symptoms. And I think it's hopefully going to preserve vision. How long, I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question. I guess the answer is I don't really know how it's going to work. I'm just hopeful.
Time for one last question.
So you are tackling this problem from many different directions and trying to help cones in different ways. Have you tried to combine all of them in the same mouse and see what happens?
No, we're working towards that though. So it's one of the things that's challenging with AAV is that you can't fit very large cargo into AAV. So we can't put all the genes into one. We have to do co-infections. So we're working on that. One of the problems we've run into is that if we deliver a really large number of particles and any of them express in the RPE, that we get into a toxic dose. Now, interestingly, if we deliver the same number of particles, same capsid, same amount of DNA, but no promoter in that mix expresses in the RPE, the promoter is specific to the photoreceptors, we don't get toxicity. So there's something about a high dose that expresses in the RPE that leads to toxicity. We're trying to solve that problem. We haven't yet. So that's one of the challenges, though. If we want to deliver a larger number of genes and have some of them expressed in the RPE, like we think NRF2 expressed in the RPE is very helpful. If we go over a certain threshold of dose and it's expressed in the RPE, then we get toxicity. So trying to solve that problem, not just for our own experiments, but it's also true in humans and animal models. There's a dose threshold for toxicity, even with Luxturna. So I think that needs to be solved by our field. We're certainly working really hard on it. I can tell you a lot of things it isn't. We've done a ton of experiments on mouse models that have lost various pathways from innate immunity and other pathways, and we haven't cured the problem. So we think it's more than one pathway that's being activated with high dose. And somehow the RPE is sensing the high dose expression in the RPE, not just presence of capsid, not just DNA, but expression in the RPE is triggering a problem. So we're working on it. But eventually, if we or others can solve this, we hope to deliver 3 or 4 different kinds of therapies. So again, something that fights oxidative damage, something for metabolism, something for inflammation.
Thank you, Connie, very much again for your presentation. I want to say how we will continue. We're now running roughly half an hour late, so my suggestion would be that we start with a panel discussion that is coming up not at the full hour, but 20 minutes after the full hour. So local time here is 2:20 when we would start, in about 50 minutes or so. And we now have a lunch break, and invite the people here to join us for the lunch break. There are 2 places for the buffet. One is right outside where you came in, but the other place, and I invite you to go there, is upstairs on the roof terrace. I encourage you to walk the 6 floors with stairs. It's very healthy, I heard, but there is an elevator as well. So we have that. If you go upstairs, please come back in time so that we start with the panel discussion at 20 minutes past the full hour. Thank you very much. Okay, welcome back, everybody, here in the room as well as online. So the last person here on stage that you do not know yet is sitting to my right, Ulrike Till. She is a science journalist who's working for German Public Radio. But today she's not here in that role. She's here as a science journalist. And she kindly agreed to host and moderate this panel discussion. We agreed that we have roughly half the time, so roughly half an hour, just the on-stage discussion, and that we would then open it up to questions in the audience. So thank you, Ulrike, for helping us out here and for moderating this event. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I'm not sure if my mic is really on. Yes, now it is. Okay. Since we have viewers and listeners who have not participated in the talks that all of you have already followed this morning, I'm briefly gonna present the participants of the panel discussion. We have Professor Eberhart Zrenner, Senior Professor of Ophthalmology at the University of Tübingen. As probably everybody who now listens in knows, he's famous for his groundbreaking work on the first retina implant to improve vision for patients with retinitis pigmentosa. And one of these patients is Miikka Terho from Finland. He's one of the very first patients who received the retina implant, actually 2 implants by now. And participating online from Boston is Constance Cepko. She's professor for genetics and ophthalmology at Harvard Medical School. Fighting blindness, that's the main topic today, and it's been a goal that scientists have been pursuing for decades. In 2005, doctors here in Tübingen, especially the team of Professor Zrenner, really made worldwide headlines with the first retina implants, and then later Second Sight with Argus. They seemed successful for a while, but unfortunately, like retina implant, they closed down a couple of years ago. More recently, there have been good news with Luxturna, the first gene therapy in ophthalmology that has been celebrated as an important milestone, but still a real breakthrough for a large number of patients. We're still all waiting for that. It hasn't happened. So the talks today have focused mainly on 2 different approaches. One is the protection of retina cells, that is the field of Constance Cepko, and restoration of light sensitivity, that is what Professor Zrenner has been focusing on. I'd like to start with Constance Cepko. You are one of the leading scientists in the protection field of research using gene therapy. And from your point of view, what are the main advantages of this genetic approach if you compare it to the restoration efforts through retinal chips?
Yeah, so I mean, the hope with the gene therapy is that it's quite durable. That is, you know, it may be long lasting. The Luxturna so far has suggested that that is true. And We don't know still how long, but at least many years. So that's one thing, is it's long lasting. The other is that there is a great deal of flexibility in the cell types that can be addressed and the timing. So by using different viral vectors or different promoters, one can directly introduce genes and have them expressed in different cell types, which might have different problems. So for example, the retinal pigment epithelium versus cones versus rods versus ganglion cells versus bipolars, that one can, with flexible design, be able to address problems that are specific to the different cell types and also at different stages in the disease. So in our work, again, we're trying to rescue cones that are still present, but perhaps might be dormant, by giving them more resiliency for whatever the environmental problems are. But you can imagine extending this to other cell types with other genes, again, to address different problems in different cell types at different stages in the disease. So I think there's a great deal of flexibility. What's lacking is our real understanding of some of the disease processes. So we still need to understand more about, again, as I mentioned, what's going on with the cones. Why are they suffering? Why are the RPE cells suffering? So I think we have that as a limiting factor, but a lot of molecular biology, cell biology, genetics is aimed at understanding those problems. So hopefully going forward, if we have the right platform in terms of viral delivery, we'll also be able to use that knowledge to have more tailored therapies. Again, different cell types, different times, different diseases.
Professor Zrenner, I'm really curious to hear what you are thinking of these genetic approaches. I mean, you're the pioneer of retina implants, and unfortunately, right now, nothing is available for patients, and the big hopes have been, well, somewhat diminished because it didn't end as well as we heard from Miikka in real life. It didn't work as hoped, or just for a small portion of cells. So why do you still see a future in retinal implants? That's what I've understood from your talk. You still think they just have to be improved, or maybe Connie is right and gene therapy is the future.
Thank you for the question. I think we need both methods and even more. Not only because of the high variety of mutations that may respond or may not respond, even in the same gene, to a certain therapeutic approach. Actually, in Tübingen here, we did the first study in achromatopsia with A3 defects in GBA3, and so we see both. And for our patients, we have a collection of more than 30,000 patients, which I started 30 years ago. I'm not saying we need an implant, that's my way. What we are looking for is treatment for the patients. So that's why we do neuroprotection with paquet Durand and fighting death signals for the cells, for instance, or gene therapy and implant. Why do we need all these approaches? If you are blind as a patient, gene therapy, at least gene replacement therapy, would not work anymore because there are cells needed you can treat. And in very advanced cases, even the number of ganglion cells still present, so clearly at the output of the retina, which are treatable, is very much reduced below 20% and even lower. There is then no possibility to protect something which is not anymore here. But of course, one would love to have protection for those ganglion cells which are still there. But then the only way presently, which has shown it works, is implants. And of course, this is a long development. I would like to add to your very kind introduction that you always are standing on shoulders of predecessors. And there is Joe Rizzo, who has shown in the surgical hall very early with a single electrode that a patient can see a spot. So we knew, in principle, it may work. And there are even people like Machem Dobel and others who have helped to understand and to estimate to what extent it can help to use electronic devices. In cochlear implant, it works wonderfully, but there is just one signal in a time, that is the auditory signal. Here in vision, we need a resolution in terms of spatial dimension. So we need, it's well known, at least something like 600 to 1,000 pixel points in order to see something useful, and even that is very low. And in many patients, the implant succeeded or surpassed our expectations, but of course, in many others, we didn't get such results. But that's quite common in medicine. Think about hip replacement, think about the tooth implantation, or even lens, which is the most common surgery nowadays. We had to remove in the 80s many lenses because the right material was not found. So we need both or three approaches: protect what you have, treat what you can do with the remaining cells. So you try to have many remaining cells. If they are gone, and there will be many patients which cannot be helped with gene therapy, further develop the implantology.
One main difference between gene therapy and a retina implant is that, at least up until now, the retina implant, after a couple of years, stops working for biological reasons and it has to be removed. Whereas gene therapy, you give one injection and then it's there forever. It might stop working at some point, but you've received that injection. You can't go back, even if it might lead to side effects that are not desired. So my question for Miikka Terho, you've been asked a while back whether you would risk having a third implant if a new study came up, and you said yes, you do it for the science. I was very impressed because that seemed such a completely altruistic approach. And now, from all you've heard about new gene therapies and the implant research that is still ongoing, if you could choose between being participating in a study for gene therapy or an implant, which would you choose?
About 10 years ago, I started learning more and more about gene therapies and also about the visual prostheses. Then I also learned what you just heard from Professor Zrenner, that gene therapy has not been an answer to me for many, many, many years, because I don't have any remaining cells supposedly left anymore. So there's nothing to restore.
Yeah, but hypothetically, if your disease was at an earlier stage, from a patient point of view, would that prospect of getting some kind of permanent genetic change inside the eye, is that a terrifying thought? Or
no, I mean, at the same time, about 10 years ago, I really was, a couple of years that I was so keen to read everything about stem cells, along with the retinal prostheses. And then I was like, wow, that might be a stem cell approach. That's probably the pathway, the most logical pathway to the so-called normal seeing. And I was kind of interested in that one, but then the development around the world kind of stopped, and I have not really followed it so closely over the past couple of years. But yes, to your question, of course, any kind of I would be interested in. Of course, I'm not afraid of getting into any kind of a study project.
Stem cells, actually, that's something I wanted to at least briefly touch upon later. But since you brought it up, Connie Cepko and Professor Zrenner, how promising is that approach? Have there been recent results that raise hope?
Yeah, I think we host may have to say something.
Ah.
Connie, would you like to respond first?
Sure. So I think the stem cells are a really interesting idea and possibly will be developed into effective therapies. I think there's a ways to go. There's a couple issues. So origin of the stem cells. So now that we have the iPSC technology, meaning we can take cells from various tissues, including skin, we can develop stem cells from different individuals that have different genetic backgrounds, and that's going to help in terms of understanding the disease in a dish, but also matching the sort of immune system response to different stem cell derived grafts. So that's good.
Yeah. So, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think the problem is that the question that is the development of the retina. Cells are connecting to each other even after birth, and some cells have to die to get a normal retina, and that plasticity of the retina is lost in adulthood. So my reservation is that yes, you may be able to develop a stem cell into a photoreceptor, but to get the connection into the host retina, which in this newborn baby had a very clever mechanism to kill a few cells to make place for other ones and so on, and that this mechanism may not work in the adults. And I think that some of the people I have spoken to feel similarly, and that's why it has not stopped really, but has been reduced in the developmental area to a great degree.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to go there, but I was sort of systematically going through what I see as the problems. So one is just graft rejection. The second would be developing the proper cells in the dish, which can be done. And I think the progress there is going to continue. So I think one can generate the right cell type in a dish. All that we've learned from developmental biology is being applied. There's a practical aspect of delivering the cells. Then how do you deliver? This might be easiest and best for the RPE cells because they form just a simple epithelial monolayer. Whereas, as Zrenner said, the photoreceptors, ganglion cells, other cell types all need to form connections, and it's not clear that will happen. And what I at least understand is that it is very difficult to get those things to happen because any eye that would be grafted usually already has degeneration processes going on. So the environment is not healthy. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm pretty pessimistic about photoreceptors surviving or connecting is that the disease, retinitis pigmentosa, has told us that once the rods die, the environment is such that even healthy cones that are genetically perfect, that are connected, that have RPE and connections too, that those healthy cones that are endogenous or indigenous to the person, those die. So why would grafted cells fare any better? Because those grafted cells are going into a very noxious environment where the endogenous cones can't even survive. So to me, that the retinitis pigmentosa disease natural history tells us that it's a real uphill battle to get any grafted photoreceptors to even survive, let alone connect. Because again, the endogenous ones die. So, but maybe for something like the RPE, where you don't have to have synaptic connections, it's sort of a simple monolayer, and maybe that will be more successful. And I know that's where different groups are going. And then how to actually put in the graft, there's a number of different strategies as a sheet, with matrix, without matrix, as individual cells. They're also easy to make in a dish. So I think maybe there is an easier path.
I completely agree. For AMD, for instance, there are a number of groups who replace RPE. We are in complete harmony on that point.
So let's leave the stem cell aspect that doesn't seem so promising right now for obvious reasons, or I didn't know them before, but it sounded very convincing what you said, Connie. a very general question. If you are thinking a decade ahead, again, it's both of you researchers, what is the best result that you think can be achieved? I mean, Miikka has told us a lot about flickering images, about ghost-like visions, and it just didn't seem convincing as a long-term perspective. So what is the best result that can be reached? Could it ever be like real normal seeing?
I'm reluctant that we will achieve such a goal because of several reasons. One is the geometry of the retina. In the fovea, we have a very high density of cones, and especially in the foveola, which give us the perfect vision in the center. But there's a very small area, and that is the one we rely most on for most tasks which we have, like looking at the scene, reading, recognizing faces. And I think that we cannot reach that density except if it will be possible, let's say, to use optogenetics for the bipolar cell, because in that particular point, each cone has its own telephone line to the brain. So if you, so to say, can really pick that particular telephone line and redo it by adding a microphone, so to say, by optogenetics, that may be the best possibility. But still, you need at least a 5-degree field, 600,000 of those cones, to get the visual acuity we have, because reading needs at least a diameter of 5 degrees, otherwise you wouldn't see a single word, only letters. And 15 degree, yes, you can do with 15 degree. If you are a Porsche driver in Germany, Autobahn 200, your peripheral visual field is shrinking so much that you only have a 15-degree field left. That means you should not go up strong curves, otherwise you may not see it. 15 degree and high resolution, my best bet is that we can get a visual acuity of something like 0.4, 0.5. In English terms, it's 20, let's say, rather be careful, 2100. That would be wonderful. But then you can still do a lot. With 15 degree, I think, Miikka, you could imagine probably the time when you had seen 15 degree, you said, even 5 degree, you were driving car, and reading was difficult. So 15 degrees, visual acuity 0.4, which you are allowed to drive cars. If we reach that, we have done it. But never will we reach what nature has developed in a few 100 million years.
Constance Cepko, is that your take as well?
Yeah, I mean, for the gene therapy perspective, or maybe even small molecule drugs combined, if we can deal with the safety issues, then, and we have vectors that are effective, let's say in late stage disease, I think we have the possibility, if they're safe, to treat much younger people. That's being done now with Luxturna. And if we can introduce genes that either prevent the death of rods, or at least slow down dramatically the death of cones as secondary effects, then I think we can extend vision indefinitely. But it's going to mean treating eyes that have not yet had a lot of degeneration. So there's more risk. You know, you don't want to stick a needle full of virus into someone's perfectly sighted eye, even if you know they're genetically headed towards loss of vision. So you have to wait for some deficit to occur to justify that risk. But if we can get the risk down significantly, and we know some of the things, at least, to introduce to keep cells alive and functioning longer, I think that it's possible. And one thing that was mentioned is optogenetic therapy. I think for those people who have lost, let's say, photoreceptors, I think we have to get into the details then of the cell types. If the photoreceptors are gone, there's no point in doing the kind of therapy I talked about. There's nothing left to save. But if the bipolars are still alive, as Zrenner just talked about, the bipolars also can participate as a sort of an upstream member of the pathways to the brain. And those, if they're endowed with optogenetic proteins, along with perhaps some of the genes I'm talking about that can preserve survival in a noxious environment, then it's possible also to get, I think, decent vision, not as good as photoreceptor mediated vision, but decent vision. So I'm hopeful that as we go forward and understand the biology more and reduce the risks as much as possible with the viral delivery, that treating younger people who have not lost a lot of cells will be able to preserve quite good vision for quite a while. So that's my hope. 10 years down the line, we'll be there. Yeah,
I agree. For preserving vision, you very nicely described it. I believe if there is still an island, a central island, that would be wonderful. I was speaking about restoring vision, which was lost already. That's where I have the skepticism.
I agree with you. I think there's no cells left to save. Gene therapy is not going to do any good. So absolutely agree with you. Yeah, I'm talking about more going forward when we have we know who's at risk from the genetics, and we have therapies that aren't that risky. And I think that's, if we can get to that point, and I'm again hoping in 10 years we will, then we won't have a lot of people. I mean, there'll still be people who have no cells left to save, absolutely. But hopefully the numbers over the years will go down if we can address things earlier. So then now I'm talking more like decades out, but that's still in the realm of possibility.
I liked your neuroprotective approach very much, because even in gene therapy, if it works, we need probably hundreds of different gene replacement therapies, and each one has to be looked at by the FDA, and within the last 5 years, only a single one was approved. So we still will have many people around who cannot benefit from gene therapy, but maybe they can benefit in the future, even within their lifetime or in the lifetime of their children and grandchildren. But if you, with your neuroprotective approaches, can prolong the vision until a therapeutic approach is available, which one ever, then this would be a great, great benefit. What is your expectation that neuroprotection, so many things have been tried, since Michael Lavai and all the people who try to protect the retina with all kinds of possibilities, which are all very logical. When will we have a mutation-independent neuroprotective possibility?
Well, I hope we're closing in on that. I mean, we actually screened about 100 genes now to get the ones I talked about. So I think, just any growth factor or factor that might work elsewhere isn't guaranteed to work. I think it's going to have to be, again, empiric. So, I mean, we went through a lot of genes to get to where we are. So I think the details are really important. What cell type needs what kind of protection and when in the course of the disease. And again, it may even change during the course of the disease. So, but I hope we're closing in on something that will at least prolong vision. How many years? I don't know. It's so hard to extrapolate from mice, and I don't know how to do that. So I don't know how long, but I am hopeful that, especially with combinations, should the FDA allow us to put in combinations, that we're closing in on some pretty good protection for cones and RPE cells as well. How many years? I don't know. Again, details are going to be important. Are there side effects in people? We don't know, right? We're treating an animal that doesn't have a macula. We're hoping to test safety, of course, in primates, but there aren't good efficacy models in primates. So yeah, lots to be discovered, but at least from a theoretical perspective, I hope that we are closing in on protection across a large number of different genetic diseases This is not disease gene specific work. And we started this more than 10 years ago when it was clear to me that the number of genes was so large, and the investment, a company is not going to invest many millions of dollars for a small handful of people. I mean, Luxturna was done as a demonstration that it's possible, but even that is a small number of people. When you look at the large numbers of people with large numbers of different disease genes, it's just the gene by gene thing is just not going to be viable, at least economically from a company perspective, and even logistically. Building a lot of different vectors and testing them is hard work. So anyways, hopefully the generic approach, especially in combination, is giving us the ability to protect for some number of years, I'm hoping at least. And yes, maybe something better will come along that's more targeted, and that would be great too.
So would you agree then that we need really all the three approaches for different stages, different patients, for individuals? Yes. So at least neuroprotection, gene replacement therapy, whatever method, CRISPR-Cas or AAV vectors, maybe not so important. Well, if available, optogenetics as a fourth method, but that's far away. Would that be your position as well?
Yeah, so I'm 100% in agreement with you. If there's no cells left to save or not enough cells left to save, then gene therapy is not going to help at all. Depending on which cell type is gone, the optogenetics targeted again to bipolars if photoreceptors are gone, to cones if they still exist, even to ganglion cells should they still be healthy enough. I think optogenetics is a promising strategy. However, it's going to give function, but it won't necessarily prolong survival. So I think optogenetics also has to be combined with something that keeps the cells alive longer. So I believe, though, that that's a viable approach, is optogenetics plus neuroprotection. And again, neuroprotection in an earlier stage where there are healthy cells to save, again, reducing risk, going earlier in the disease course, I'm very hopeful that that will help people in that position. But as you said, not everybody's in that position. Some people have lost all their photoreceptors. Some have further damage to the inner retina. Some people have lost a lot of ganglion cells. So we do need all the approaches. And if we fast forward 50 years where we've been able to intervene earlier, maybe more people will have retained more cells that we can rescue. And so ultimately, we might get to a place where we have, various ways of approaching early stage disease to preserve vision so that we don't have such a gross loss of cells. Mm-hmm. But yes, currently I agree with you 100%. We need multiple approaches.
At this point, I would like to get Miikka back into the discussion and ask him, from a patient point of view, in your talk, you've said at some point that the second implant, that was more like a nice toy to have. It didn't really help you in your everyday life, not as much as maybe hoped for, although you said you are realistic. But from a patient point of view, what is the threshold above which you would say, okay, now it can be considered a success?
Especially during the second implant, if I had been able to walk on the streets and get a pretty good understanding of direction of the street, see the buildings, so get the overall picture, that would have been a big benefit.
Yeah. So the hopes that many patients voice, they want to be able to recognize people, to watch TV. Would you say that is maybe they reach too high? They should be okay with less, or is that not a good thought?
When I started the project, of course, that was my goal too. So I'm not saying that their expectations are too high. Now I'm definitely more experienced than those ones who had no experience. They expect more, which is natural. But now I know the limitations of the current technology, and I emphasize current technology.
Yeah, and when you hear these leading research experts talk about possibilities for the future, how is that for you? What are you thinking?
I think I was at the Arvo in Fort Lauderdale was it 2009? I spoke to many of the big-time international, big brains, very knowledgeable people. We talked about the stem cells and future possibilities. And then people said, okay, we have to wait 5 to 10 more years. Okay, that 5 to 10 more years is already passed by. Now we talk about another 10 more years. But this is science. So I take it in the future, what comes, I don't really worry about it. And I'm not going to start counting days or weeks or months or years.
But you are confident that some good will come in the future, that it will lead to something
Well,
positive.
I mean, if I just look at the history of the mankind, there's always development. But for me, I'm 59 years old today, so for me, if I get the normal eyesight back when I'm 80, am I gonna enjoy about it? Not much. I'm not gonna be able to walk on the beach, enjoy that much, because I'm getting too old. So perhaps not for me, but definitely for the future, no doubt.
We should start the opening up questions in the audience in maybe like 5 minutes tops. So we filled the first half hour. It went very quickly. So I would like to ask really the main final question. I've basically already asked Miikka, but Professor Zrenner and Connie Cepko, how optimistic are you that there will one day really be a cure, not just postponing decay or restoring a little bit of vision?
Okay, if you think back, the first gene was discovered in 1984, which is responsible for RP. So at that time we thought, oh, now we have the key. But it was only one mutation. It was very crucial at that time. So we are not working very long in the history of mankind on therapies. Anything before was no hope. Now we see so many aspects. Even what Miikka said, I agree with you that a small field which nowadays implants can provide will not help you for getting around in a town. But I know that many groups are active. There is a European community grant, a huge one, where people in Switzerland, in Lausanne, are developing a kind of an umbrella where you fill the retina with that umbrella, light sensitive, so you would get a larger view. I know that in so many areas research is active, so I'm pretty sure that we see step by step. There will be not a huge sudden solution to everything, but step by step more and more patients will benefit because the principles have been shown.
Yeah. Connie Cepko.
Yeah, I'm very optimistic. I mean, the way the genetics and molecular biology have the pace of development of technologies and understanding is just astonishing to me. So if this trajectory continues, our understanding of the biology is a little lagging, the technology. And as I mentioned, I do think we still have serious gaps in our understanding of the disease process. That to me is something that we need to keep working on with all the new tools that come along. I think the interventions that I mentioned, the genetic interventions, we didn't even talk about gene editing, but that's another possibility. I think that those are going to continue to develop. But in my mind, the biggest gap is our understanding of the disease biology. That's hard. You basically have to do it in vivo. All of our work is in vivo. We don't bother treating cells in a dish. So I think we just need a lot of dedicated people who continue to look at mechanism of the degeneration. And I think the tools for introducing genes and manipulating genes in vivo are there, and we'll just keep getting better. So I'm very optimistic about the future of this field.
That is a nice final word for the first half of the panel discussion. And now, hopefully, it's going to be a real discussion. Thomas took the mic and will take questions.
Thanks for the information you share with us. I would like to ask just a specific question to the Professor Cepko. If I understood well, after the cons degeneration, it's also triggered by loss of the structure in the retina due to rods degeneration. Did you ever try just to restore the proper structure of the retina? And yeah, this is my question. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really hard one. So we've thought a lot about how and what kind of structure could we restore. And one was just to try to make the area where the rods used to reside, there's a collapse, there's a physical collapse. You can see the RPE and the cone outer segments sort of flopping over and losing their normal structure. So part of that, I think, is the loss of the apical processes of the RPE, which we see are retained with NRF2. So in one way, you could say that that's a structural response to the introduction of the RPE, the NRF2 into the RPE specifically. But that whole volume that's lost when the outer nuclear layer goes away, the only thing we've tried, and we didn't try hard enough, I would say, but we were thinking if we could introduce a gel, if we could inject a liquid gel and then use light to make it gel, that we might at least create a little sort of space around the cones that might allow them to sort of push back on the collapsing RPE. So I think that still might be a viable approach. We just didn't technically advance it as well as we should have. And the other thing I like about the gel idea is that you can put in small molecules or ligands along with the gel injection and maybe have like a slow release depot from the gel itself. So I think that's still a possibility. I hope somebody takes that up.
If I may add, I think that there are several slow processes that depend on the transport mechanisms to get the daily trash away. Each of our photoreceptors is renewed within 8 to 10 days. And within these 8 to 10 days, you have to get the trash away from those little parts that are not functional anymore. So we see mechanisms where you can either improve the removal of trash, so structure recovers, or you even could use other things like VCP inhibitors, where we see that disordered outer segments are becoming better if you use a VCP inhibitor. So there are some possibilities as long as the cells are not too sick, too sick or too much changed in their structure.
So I do have a question. First, Professor Zrenner, I wanted to ask whether you ever saw any neuroprotection through the stimulating by the chip. So whether the frequent electric triggering caused maybe bipolar cells or ganglion cells to degenerate slower, whether there were any hints or whether just the numbers weren't big enough yet.
That's a very interesting question. Yes, there are hints not only in our patient population, but also at second sight and other patients where after switching off the power of the implant, after some days, patient really reported and convincingly reported that they suddenly could see better if they had sometimes, let's say, islands in the periphery. There was still some vision but not useful. So there were some patients who said, okay, I can see that bright light, but only if I really look for it. And those little islands, which didn't help them in daily living, they become a little bit larger. But these are, so to say, some findings in some patients, statistically not valid, but there is a good indicator, and also electrostimulation, we know pretty well, is releasing growth factors of several kinds, and that's also a therapeutic approach we didn't speak about, not therapeutic but protective, let's say, to have, so to say, an endogenous release of of natural growth factors by electrostimulation, and usually that wears off after 7 days. So one can nicely see in rats and mice that electrostimulation increases certain growth factors, and after 7 days you can give them another shot to increase again, but there's still a lot to do, and it's certainly not helpful for every kind of those different diseases, but for certain ones.
Okay, and my other question would be to Professor Cepko. I mean, you said that all the therapies, you had different approaches now for some neuroprotective approaches for the retina, but they're all developed in mice, and you're using a lot of tools like GFP, so you know where you're expressing. I guess you cannot use that in humans, so how will you check that where you're pressing? And your promoters, they are probably developed for the mice and very nicely working there. But how are you going to translate your different approaches from the mouse to the primate model?
Yeah, again, I think the best might be initially to work with non-human primates. And the promoters we've been using are from human genes. And some of them have already been used in primates, and they work as they do in mice. So at least for some of them, I believe they've been validated as well as possible in the primates. I would expect something that works in a primate to work in humans. Botan Braska's lab actually did a really nice survey. They made, I think, 200 or so AAVs that they first tested with different promoters. They first tested in mice, and then they tested in primates. And sadly, only about half of them recapitulated in primates what they saw in mice. But the ones that they saw worked in the primates, and this is in vivo in primates, they then tested in human organoids. And most of the ones that worked in the primates did work in the human organoids with the same specificity. So I think that's what could be done. And again, the ones that we're using already do work in that regard. So I think we're kind of in pretty good shape for cone promoters and RPE promoters. Hopefully those are going to work also for our genes. They have worked for others. Actually, tracking the inoculation site's an interesting question. I think that, we use GFP to mark where we've injected. We've moved away from that, and now more recently we use fluorescent beads. Again, I don't think you do that in humans, but we're trying to move away from using GFP as a marker because GFP as a protein and RPE tends to be quite toxic. But when the surgeons introduce the vector into a person, they know where they photograph, they know where they've delivered it. And that really helps in terms of follow-up to see what's happened in that area. Again, they call it a bleb, but that area of inoculation is only about 15%. So it is important to document where was it delivered so follow-up can be targeted to that area and the surrounding area in case there's non-autonomous effects.
I have a question, if I may, to Miikka. So one thing you mentioned is that light objects or dark backgrounds are better. I used to work a lot on the differences of on-channels and off-channels in the retina, so like neural pathways that are sensitive to light increments or that are sensitive to light decrements. So what I wanted to ask you, when you received the electrical stimulation through the chip, was it always like flashes of light that were the perception, or was it also sometimes flashes of shadows that were the perception? So that you have like spots of shadows that turned on, if you want to call it.
I really don't remember of anything like a shadow kind of a images. Perhaps, now when you ask it, okay, now I have to go back in time, a long time ago. It was, well, I really don't know. I just cannot remember exactly. Because the flashes, yeah, they were clear. But then the shadows at the same time, or right by it.
Let me call it differently. We had some patients who told us that after onset they saw a black dot. Did that happen to you instead of a white dot? I vaguely remember.
You mean a black dot? You mean?
Yeah, so instead of you have the gray zone and,
okay.
then what Emil called a shadow could have been, let's say, a black
well, at least I never paid attention to it, so it was not clear and obvious.
But it was rare, this observation by patients, to see black dots after electrostimulation. It did happen in some cases.
So do you think that your chip, the way it's inserted, the way it acts electrically on the cells that are still there, that the chip might activate specifically on channels in the retina, on bipolar cells?
Yeah, the way we do it, which is a bipolar pulse with a negative pulse first and a positive pulse afterwards, stimulates preferably on cells. If you turn that around, if you turn the polarity around, the sequence of polarity, you may get more off responses. That's a mouse. That's what we learned in mouse.
Because I was thinking of that when Miikka said that he could more easily recognize the bright objects, and also that walking around during the daylight was problematic, where everything is bright. So maybe just reversing the polarity would solve that problem, potentially.
But as there are more on cells, we thought we should work with them first. Okay.
There's one more question here, please.
Hi, this question is for Miikka. I want to say again, thank you very much for coming here to tell us about your experiences. So as you know, these devices don't last forever. You know this quite well. And not only have you been implanted with 2 devices, but you've also had 2 devices removed. And so I'd love to get your perspective on sort of what you think about the ethics of, neural implants and the fact that they have a lifetime and will have to be removed at some point, presumably in any time in the near future.
You mean a lifetime of a specific chip in a person's eye?
Yeah, exactly, right. The chips don't last forever. Cortical implants don't last forever. This has been an issue in a lot of neural prosthetics. They have a finite lifetime. And so, how is the experience for you having a device that you would come to appreciate and rely on then be removed?
Well, the second chip, I had it for a little over 6 years. When I got it, I was told that, okay, we hope that it will last 5 years. Then, of course, there's even if a person gets a chip today and if it lasts for 10 years, well, there would be plenty of development during those years. So even if a life expectancy of a retinal chip today would be about 5 years, I think that would be fine for many patients. Because after 5 years, there would probably be much better ones. But for me, to have it for 5 years, working well, if it had worked fine and well, then of course it would have been very difficult to get rid of it. Yeah, then I would have definitely wanted to get the second one, even the more improved one. That would be the natural behavior of anyone, I think.
That's of course a very important question, and we discussed it a lot also with our ethics professors. But it is a common observation in medicine that in the initial phases of a new development of, so to say, replacement, including teeth, even the cardiac pacemaker in the beginning had to be removed quite often, and also cochlear implant, we know that. There are nice data actually from the beginning of something new. There is, so to say, an inherent knowledge, inherent danger that in the beginning the lifetime of non-biological materials in the body need development, and if you have 5 years for the regulatory authorities, it's already fine for the beginning.
Are there more questions? Because if not, I would hand back to Ulrike for some concluding remarks, maybe.
Yeah. Thank you so much for listening in and being present here for the Striatech Symposium on Hopes and Hurdles on the Way to Restoring Vision for Patients with Degenerative Eye Diseases. Many, many thanks to retinitis patient Miikka Terho from Finland, to Professor Connie Cepko from Harvard Medical School, and Senior Professor Eberhart Zrenner from the University of Tübingen.
It's been a pleasure.
I also would like to take the opportunity to thank all the participants on stage and on TV, Connie. Thank you very much. Ulrike, we have a little present for you. And
thank you very much.
For Professor Zrenner and Miikka as well. So I'm on a leash.
And you will send a parcel to Harvard?
Yes, we do.
Yeah.
Only if you come to Tübingen, we will share.
Okay, thank you very much.
I put it on the table for you as a little present.
It's actually wonderful. Great, thank you.
Very nice of you, thanks.
And yet another thank you to our wonderful team in-house, Lena, who just left, and Athanasia, who is not here, but will be here any second. There they are. And Jesse, who did a lot of work on the technical stuff and who's pointing the camera at me. So if you could come here, Jesse, for a moment. And please, a round of applause for these people. And thank you, of course, all of you for joining us here. Thank you for the people online joining us. We also have a present for you guys here because there's still more cake and more coffee and champagne So you're welcome to stick around just a bit longer and enjoy that. Have maybe some more discussions with our speakers or amongst yourselves. And thank you again for coming and joining us here.